The loudest man on the range had spent 11 years making grown soldiers cry. He picked her because she was small, because she was quiet, because she sat alone under a rusted canopy adjusting a rifle scope like she was threading a needle, completely unbothered by 60 men shouting around her. He called her a gear monkey in front of everyone. She didn't flinch, didn't look up. Finished tightening the last screw, set the torque wrench down with one soft click, and finally raised her eyes. What happened next would end his career, rewrite the Academy's training doctrine, and force every man on that range to question everything they thought they knew about strength. If this story finds you tonight, like, follow, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. The desert at Red Mesa didn't cool down at dawn. It just shifted, from the kind of heat that punished you for moving to the kind that punished you for breathing. By 0630, the air over the firing lanes already tasted like hot copper and fine grit, the kind that worked into the threads of your rifle and the creases behind your ears and stayed there no matter how many times you cleaned yourself out. The sun came up fast and mean at Red Mesa, like it had somewhere to be and didn't care who it burned on the way. Master Sergeant Cole Barrett liked that about this place. He liked that the heat made people slow, made them stupid, made the weak ones start making mistakes by mid-morning that they wouldn't make anywhere else, fumbling their loadouts, squinting too hard at their targets, flinching at the percussion from neighboring lanes because their bodies were already working too hard just to exist in this temperature. Cole had spent 11 years at Red Mesa Tactical Center, and he understood, with the particular certainty of a man who had built his entire identity around a single skill set, that the desert filtered people, stripped away the polish and the promises, left only what was real. And what was real, in Cole Barrett's worldview, was volume. A man who commanded space, who moved with authority and spoke loud enough that nobody questioned whether he belonged. That was a man worth watching. That was a man who'd hold under pressure. Cole had seen it proved out too many times to doubt it. The quiet ones always hesitated, always second-guessed, always went small when small was the worst thing you could go. He was explaining exactly this to the morning's intake group when he first noticed her. 43 trainees had assembled on the Central Range at 0615 for orientation. Federal contractors, reserve specialists, a handful of active duty personnel cycling through advanced marksmanship evaluation. They stood in two loose rows facing the primary shooting benches while Cole worked the front of the formation, pacing, projecting, filling the morning with the controlled thunder of his own voice. He was mid-sentence about trigger discipline when some peripheral flicker pulled his attention left. Under the equipment canopy, a corrugated metal overhang on the range's western edge, meant for storing spare targets and sandbags, a woman sat alone at the end of a folding table. Plain field fatigues, no unit patch, no rank insignia anywhere visible. She had a precision rifle broken down in front of her, barrel separated from the action, the whole assembly spread across a worn canvas mat with the careful order of someone who did this by feel and didn't need to think about it anymore. Her left hand held the receiver steady, while her right worked a small torque wrench around the base of the optic mount with slow, deliberate rotations. She hadn't looked up when the formation assembled, hadn't looked up when Cole raised his voice. She was doing what she was doing, at the pace she'd decided to do it, and the 43 people 20 meters away did not appear to register as relevant to any of that. Cole stopped mid-sentence. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a place he rarely visited and visited even less willingly, something stirred. A small, instinctive unease, almost animal. The same quiet alarm that good soldiers learn to pay attention to and bad soldiers learn to talk over. Cole talked over it. "Hold on," he said to the formation, loud enough to make two trainees flinch. He turned and walked toward the canopy with the unhurried stride of a man who owned the ground he walked on. Behind him, he could feel the formation's attention track his movement the way it always did. Good. Let them watch. This was also a lesson. He stopped 2 meters from her table. The woman hadn't looked up. "This is a restricted range during live fire orientation," he said. "Equipment maintenance is scheduled after the primary block, not during." Nothing. She rotated the torque wrench one more quarter turn, stopped, checked the tension, rotated it back a fraction. Cole felt a familiar heat that had nothing to do with the desert. "Hey, you hear me?" "I heard you." Her voice was flat and unhurried. She still didn't look up. "I'm not in your formation. You're under my canopy." "I'm under a canopy. she said. "Nobody's name on it." One of the trainees in the back row made a sound that was half laugh and half swallowed cough. Cole heard it. His jaw tightened. He looked her over more carefully now. The rifle on the mat was a bolt-action precision platform. He recognized the receiver profile, a custom build around a chassis he'd seen maybe twice before. The kind of setup that cost more than some people's cars and required a machinist, a patient armorer, and a very specific kind of shooter to make useful. The optic on the mount was a first focal plane scope with a tactical turret system he didn't recognize offhand, which meant it was either foreign manufacture or something not yet in standard catalogs. The canvas mat beneath everything was old and oil-stained and had the kind of organized wear that came from years of actual use, not display. He registered all of this in about 3 seconds, and then filed it under irrelevant because the alternative required him to adjust a worldview he'd spent 11 years constructing. "Who are you assigned to?" he asked. "I'm an independent observer for this evaluation block." She set the torque wrench down and picked up a small lens cloth. "My credentials are on file with your range admin. You can check them after your orientation." "I'd like to know now." She finally looked up. Cole had expected, without quite knowing he'd expected it, some expression that confirmed his read on her. Nerves, apology, maybe defiance, which he could work with. Instead, he got something closer to the face a person makes when they've looked at a clock and noted the time without any particular feeling about it. Just information, registered and set aside. "Evelyn Cross," she said, "and you're wasting your group's morning." She went back to cleaning the lens. Cole stood there for 2 seconds longer than he should have. Then he turned and walked back to the formation, and the heat pressed in behind him like it always did, like the desert itself was crowding close to watch. The orientation block ran until 900. Cole delivered it the way he always did, methodically, loudly, laced with enough corrective pressure to keep the trainees on their heels. He knew from experience that groups needed to feel slightly off balance during intake. Comfortable trainees made assumptions. Assumptions got people hurt. So he moved through the material with the particular energy of a man who wanted everyone to understand, at a fundamental level, that nothing here was going to be as easy as they'd planned. He covered the range safety protocols twice. Once because it was required. Once because he caught a contractor in the 3rd row checking his watch. He covered the target scoring system, the wind call methodology they'd be using, the malfunction clearance drills scheduled for the afternoon block. He walked the group through the range's radio protocol, which at Red Mesa was non-negotiable. Every shooter maintained communication with the range officer throughout their stage, called their ready status, confirmed target acknowledgement before every string. No exceptions, no shortcuts. The desert was full of people who'd decided procedures were for other people, and a fair number of them weren't around to have changed their minds. Through all of it, he was aware of her. Not constantly, not obsessively, just in that peripheral way. The way you're always slightly aware of a door that's been left open in a space that's supposed to be sealed. She had completed her maintenance work by 07:15 and spent the remainder of the orientation at the canopy table with a small notebook open in front of her, writing things down in handwriting too small for Cole to read from 20 meters. She didn't watch him, didn't watch the formation. Every so often she'd glance downrange at something, a heat shimmer, a target stake, nothing visible, and then look back at whatever she was writing. She ate a granola bar at 0840 and didn't offer anyone else one. Cole caught himself thinking about her setup again. The chassis system, the optic, the way her hands had moved on the torque wrench, not the quick efficiency of someone showing off their competence, but the slower patience of someone for whom this was just maintenance, unremarkable. Something you did carefully because the alternative was imprecision, and imprecision had consequences that she apparently took seriously. He caught himself thinking this and stopped. At 09:05, with the morning's administrative block finished and the trainees moving to their assigned shooting stations for the first live fire sequence, Cole made his decision. It wasn't premeditated. That's what he'd tell himself later, in the quieter moments when he had no choice but to examine what happened. It wasn't calculated cruelty. It was the thing that came naturally when a man who'd built himself on the foundation of being the most competent person in the room sensed something in the room that might not agree. He drifted toward the canopy during the 5-minute break between the administrative block and the first live fire stage. 3 of the trainees tracked his movement, hoping, the way trainees always did, to understand what the instructor found worth paying attention to. He stopped at the edge of the canopy. The woman, Cross, had her notebook closed and was running a boar snake through the rifle barrel, pulling it through with the same slow deliberateness she applied to everything. The assembled rifle sat on its bipod beside her, bolt open, chamber visible, ready for inspection, ready for use. "You shoot?" Cole asked. She didn't look up from the boar snake. "Some. We've got an open lane in the first string." He gestured toward the firing line. 1,500 meters. Wind's about 6 knots right to left, variable. Might be educational for an observer. The word observer had a particular weight when he put it on her. He'd calculated that. She'd called herself an independent observer, so he'd give that back to her with about 12 extra pounds of condescension wrapped around it. She pulled the boar snake through one more time, held the barrel up, and looked down it toward the light. Whatever she saw satisfied her. She set it down and started seating the bolt. "What are we shooting?" she asked. Cole blinked. He'd expected a deflection. "Standard precision stage, 5 rounds, distance targets from 800 to 1,500 meters, scored on impact location and time." "What rifle?" "I'll be using my personal system. You can use one from the armory." He let that sit for a second. The implication that she'd be at a disadvantage before she even touched the trigger. She glanced at the rifle she'd spent the last hour assembling and maintaining, and then at him. "I'll use mine," she said. "It's not zeroed to this range." She picked up the rifle, checked the chamber, engaged the safety, and stood up. "I know." The trainees gathered. Cole hadn't explicitly told them to watch. He didn't need to. Groups had an instinct for this kind of thing, for the moments when the day's normal rhythm shifted into something with higher stakes. They arranged themselves behind the benches in a loose cluster, some of them with spotting scopes, a few just standing with their arms crossed, waiting. The range officer, Specialist Terrence Dugan, 26 years old, 3 years at Red Mesa, a man who understood precisely who held rank on this range and what that meant for his own best interests, set up the scoring protocol without being asked. He'd been doing this long enough to read the room. Cole took the primary bench. He ran his pre-staged checklist the way he always did, unhurried, thorough, the kind of deliberate preparation that was its own performance. He adjusted his bipod, verified his zero, pulled the data book from his kit bag, and cross-referenced his dope for the morning's conditions. He made one small turret adjustment for the wind, made a note of it. He settled into his position, worked through 3 dry fire repetitions to verify his natural point of aim, and came up. "Ready?" he told Dugan. "Shooter ready," Dugan said into the radio. "Range is hot. First string, Master Sergeant Barrett. 5 rounds, 800 to 1,500 meters, mixed order, command fire." Cole took his first shot at 800 meters 19 seconds after the command. It was a good shot. Center mass on the steel plate, solid impact sound drifting back on the wind a half-second after the break. He worked the bolt, reacquired, moved to the 1,200-meter target. Good. Moved to 1,500? Good. Came back to the 850 plate for the 4th round. Impact, confirmed. And closed out the string at 1,300 meters with a shot that hit 2 inches right of center, which was within acceptable variance for the wind condition. 5 rounds, 5 confirmed hits. He stood, cleared the rifle, turned around. The trainees were clapping. Not all of them, but enough. Dugan had a look on his face that said, as expected, no surprises here, and Cole absorbed all of this the way he always did, the way a man absorbs rain when he's learned to expect it. "Your turn," he said to Evelyn Cross. She didn't respond immediately. She was standing 4 feet to his left, rifle at her side, barrel down, watching the target line through the natural range of her vision. Not through glass, not through a scope, just looking at the distance the way some people looked at a map they'd already memorized. Cole watched her. Behind him, he could hear the low murmur of the trainees settling in, adjusting positions, people with spotting scopes getting their glass up. Dugan was on the radio clearing the range for the second shooter. "Any adjustments you want to make before you start?" Cole asked. His tone was helpful. The helpful tone was worse than the contemptuous one, and he knew it. "Already made them," she said. She moved to the bench. And here was the first thing that people would talk about afterward. The first detail that would get repeated in the break room, in the armory, and eventually in the hallways of the administrative block. The way she moved when she got behind the rifle was different. Not dramatically, not in any way you could immediately name, but different the way that certain sounds are different. You don't know what's missing until you hear the real thing, and then you can't unhear the absence. She didn't perform preparation. She prepared. There was no sequence of movements designed to communicate competence. She went prone on the bench with the economy of someone sitting down to a task they'd done enough times that their body had its own memory of it, independent of conscious instruction. She settled behind the optic, made one small bipod adjustment, a fraction of an inch, left leg only, and went still. The kind of still that takes most people years to learn. Cole had seen some very good shooters in 11 years. He'd trained federal contractors, combat veterans, law enforcement precision teams, military personnel from 6 different countries. He'd seen a lot of different versions of what ready looked like in a precision shooter. This was a different version. He couldn't name what was different about it, and that bothered him more than he was willing to examine. Dugan's voice came over the range speaker. Shooter ready. Range is hot, second string. Observer cross, 5 rounds, 800 to 1500 meters. Mixed order, command fire. She went still, completely still. No micro adjustments, no settling, already there. The wind moved through the canopy behind them, pushing the faint smell of hot metal and gun oil across the range. Somewhere down the line, a bird, something desert adapted, brown and quick, landed on a target stake and was gone again before anyone thought to look. Dugan called the first target. She shot it. Cole heard the break. Clean, no flinch reaction in her position. The rifle came back to 0 in under half a second. And then the delayed ring of steel at 800 meters, solid center impact. Second target, she shot it, center mass. The ring came back on the wind at the same pitch as his had, which told him the hit location was comparable. Third target, 1,500 meters. She was on it before Dugan finished calling it, the muzzle already tracked to the distance, and the shot broke with the same quiet inevitability as the 2 before it. Hit confirmed. Cole was watching her through his own spotting scope now. She'd barely moved. Her position hadn't shifted by anything measurable. The rifle was coming back to 0 between shots so fast and so cleanly that it looked more like a mechanical function than a human one. Her breathing, the thing that broke most people at this distance, was invisible. He couldn't see it in her shoulders. Couldn't see it in the rifle. Fourth target. Hit. She came to the 5th shot and did something Cole hadn't done. She paused. Not long. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Just a pause. A stillness inside the stillness. Some internal recalibration that he couldn't see and couldn't measure. Then she fired. The sound from 1,500 meters came back with a slightly different note. Confirmed impact, Dugan said, but his voice had gone strange, quieter, like a man who was adding something up and didn't trust the answer he was getting. Shooter, please hold position while I verify scoring. She stood immediately, cleared the rifle without being told, safety on, bolt back, chamber empty, barrel down, and stepped away from the bench. Nobody spoke. The radio crackled. There was a pause that stretched itself out to an uncomfortable length, the kind of silence that makes 30-something people look at each other without wanting to be the first one to say anything. Then Dugan's voice came back. And in 11 years of standing on this range, Cole Barrett had never heard Terrence Duggan sound like this. Master Sergeant? A short pause. Could you come to the scoring station? Cole walked. Behind him, the trainees followed in a loose cluster, the way people follow when they know something has happened but don't yet know what kind of thing. He looked at the target report. Shot 1. Impact confirmed, 800 meters. 8 ring, left of center. Decent. Shot 2. Impact confirmed, 1,200 meters. 9 ring, center. Very good. Shot 3. Impact confirmed, 1,500 meters. 10 ring. Excellent. Shot 4. Impact confirmed, 850 meters. 9 ring, right of center. Shot 5. Cole read the notation twice. Then he looked up at Dugan. Dugan looked back at him with the expression of a man who would very much have preferred to be somewhere else for this particular moment. Shot 5, impact confirmed, 1,500 meters. Impact location, coincident with shot 3. Single entry point, diameter consistent with one round. Measurement 0.31 inches. The air went out of the morning. 2 shots. 1,500 meters. Through the same hole. Cole read it again. The numbers didn't change. He became aware slowly of the sound of the trainees reacting around him. A low, spreading murmur. Not loud, not theatrical, just the quiet sound of 30-something people recalibrating at the same time. He heard someone say something he couldn't make out. He heard someone else say, "No way," in a tone that was more reflex than argument. He turned around. Evelyn Cross was back under the canopy. She was reassembling the bipod she'd removed for transport, her hands moving through the process with the same unhurried pace as everything else. She wasn't watching him, wasn't watching the group. Whatever had just happened on the target line had not, as far as her body language communicated, produced anything in her that resembled the response you'd expect. Cole walked toward her. He wasn't sure what he was going to say. He was aware of the trainees behind him, aware of Dugan at the scoring station, aware of the wind and the heat and the particular quality of the silence that had settled over Red Mesa like something heavy set down gently. He was 3 steps from the canopy when a sound pulled everyone's attention to the range entrance. Tires on the access road. The specific sound of heavy vehicle suspension on hard-packed desert. Unhurried, steady, the sound of something with authority that didn't feel the need to announce itself with speed. A black SUV came through the range gate at walking pace. Government plates. Tinted glass. No markings. It stopped 40 meters from the primary benches, engine running for 5 seconds after it parked, and then went quiet. The driver's door opened. A man in desert utilities stepped out and moved to the rear passenger door, opening it with the particular efficiency of someone whose entire function was to be ready before anyone asked. The man who got out of the back was not tall, not physically imposing. His uniform was worn with the ease of something that had been put on and taken off 10,000 times and meant nothing except that it was accurate. His face was weathered in the way that desert and time weather things. Not dramatically, just honestly. He wore the insignia of a rear admiral, and he wore it the way that certain people wear things they've earned, without display, without apology, just present. He stood beside the vehicle for a moment, looking at the range with the calm, comprehensive attention of a man assessing terrain. Then his eyes found Cole. He walked toward them. And Cole Barrett, who had not been afraid of anything on this range in 11 years, felt something settle into his chest that he didn't immediately have a name for. The rear admiral stopped 6 feet away. He looked at Cole. He looked at the canopy. He looked at the woman under it who had not looked up from her bipod assembly. "Master Sergeant," he said. His voice was unremarkable, the kind of unremarkable that carries across a room without effort. "Sir," Cole said, "I'm Rear Admiral Voss." He didn't offer to shake hands. "I'm here for the Observer Program review. I'd like someone to walk me through this morning's activities." He paused. "Starting with why my program coordinator is sitting alone under a canopy instead of running the evaluation block she was assigned." The word coordinator did not mean what Cole had spent the morning assuming it meant. Rear Admiral Voss turned and looked at Evelyn Cross directly for the first time since he'd arrived. She had set down the bipod. She was looking back at him. "Chief Cross," Voss said. "Admiral," she said, and in the way she said it, no deference, no tension, just 2 people who knew each other across a professional history that Cole was only beginning to understand existed. Cole Barrett felt the ground shift beneath him in a way that had nothing to do with the desert. He thought about the rifle, the chassis, the optic he couldn't identify. He thought about 2 rounds through the same hole at 1,500 meters, with a rifle that wasn't zeroed to this range. He thought about the way she'd paused before the last shot. 3 seconds? Maybe 4. And he thought about what it would take, what kind of experience it would take, to make that pause mean what her target results said it meant. Rear Admiral Voss turned back to Cole. "Walk me through this morning," he said. It was not a request. And Cole, standing in the heat of Red Mesa, with 43 trainees watching, with Terrence Dugan's scoring sheet still in his hand, with the particular silence of a range that knows something irreversible has just happened, opened his mouth to begin. He had no idea what he was going to say. He had even less idea what was about to be said back. Cole had given a lot of briefings in his career, after-action reports, incident reviews, The kind of formal accounting that the military demanded whenever something went sideways on a range or in a training environment. He delivered them to senior NCOs, to commissioned officers, once to a full bird colonel who'd flown in from Fort Kavanaugh specifically to hear why 3 contractors had ended up in the medical bay after a live fire exercise that was supposed to be routine. Cole had navigated every one of those conversations with the particular skill of a man who understood how institutional narratives worked, what to foreground, what to contextualize, what to frame as a judgment call, made in good faith under conditions that any reasonable person would have read the same way. He had never stood in front of a rear admiral with 43 witnesses and tried to explain why he'd publicly challenged a federal program coordinator to a shooting competition because she'd been quiet and unbothered under his canopy. "Walk me through this morning," Rear Admiral Voss had said, and Cole walked him through it. He kept his voice level and his language professional, and he left out the word gear monkey, which he'd said loudly enough for the entire formation to hear, and substituted instead a phrase about assessing observer familiarity with range equipment, which was so far from what had actually happened that it cost him something to say it. He watched Voss's face while he talked. The Admiral's expression didn't change. It had the quality of a man listening to something he's already decided about, just collecting confirmation. When Cole finished, Voss was quiet for a moment. "Specialist Dugan," he said, without turning. Dugan had positioned himself 3 meters behind Cole, with the instinct of someone who understood that the appropriate distance from whatever was about to happen was as far as possible while still being technically present. "Sir?" "The scoring sheet for the second string. Let me see it." Dugan came forward and handed it over with both hands. Voss took it with one and read it without making any visible reaction, the way certain people read things they already expected. He handed it back. "Master Sergeant Barrett," he said. "Sir?" "You've been at this facility for how long?" 11 years, sir." 11 years. Voss looked out at the target line. The heat shimmer over the downrange area made the steel plates look like they were breathing. "In 11 years, how many times have you seen a 2-round group at 1,500 meters measure under 1/3 of an inch?" Cole didn't answer. "That's not a rhetorical question." "Never, sir." "No," Voss said. "Not here. Not anywhere I've been, either." He turned back to Cole, and his expression had the quality of something that was not anger, something more patient than anger, more permanent. "So when you saw someone spending an hour calibrating a precision system this morning, what exactly did that tell you?" The heat pressed in. Somewhere on the far end of the range, one of the trainees coughed. "Sir, I'll answer my own question," Voss said. "It told you nothing because you'd already decided what she was. Before she touched the rifle, before she said a word." He held Cole's gaze for 3 seconds, which felt longer. "That is a problem for a man whose job is to evaluate capability." Cole said nothing. There was nothing to say that wasn't going to make it worse. Voss turned away from him then, which in its own way was worse than being looked at. He walked toward the canopy where Evelyn Cross had returned to her work. She'd produced a small notebook from somewhere and was writing in it again, unhurried, the rifle now fully reassembled and resting on its bipod beside her. Cole watched him go. Then he turned and looked at his trainees, 43 faces looking back at him. Not with the expectation they'd had at 06:15 when they'd assembled for orientation. Not even with the entertained discomfort of an hour ago when he'd crossed the range to confront her. Something different now. A quieter attention, calibrated in a new way, taking new measurements of the man they'd spent the morning taking instruction from. Cole turned back to the range and made himself look at the target line instead. Voss spent 40 minutes with her. Cole kept the trainees moving through their first live fire sequence during that time, because the range schedule didn't care about what had happened, and neither would the after-action review. And keeping himself occupied with work was preferable to standing around watching his own professional credibility dissipate in the desert heat. He ran the group through the first stage, corrected 2 shooters on their bipod positioning, pulled a federal contractor out of the line for an unsafe muzzle orientation, and maintained enough operational normality that the morning didn't completely fall apart. He was aware of the canopy the entire time. Not obsessively, just the way you're aware of a room with an open door when you've been told there's something in it you need to deal with eventually. He caught fragments, not words, the distance was too great, but the tone of their conversation reached him occasionally on the wind, even, controlled, specific. The back-and-forth rhythm of two people who were discussing something with mutual familiarity, not briefing each other or performing for an audience. At one point, he saw Voss pull out a tablet and show her something on the screen, and she leaned forward slightly, not much, the way you lean towards something you're interested in rather than something you're being shown for the first time. At 10:30, Voss walked back across the range toward the SUV and the driver moved to open the rear door. He stopped near Cole on the way. "I'll need you in the admin block at 1400, he said. "Bring your range log and your personnel files for this intake group." "Yes, sir." Voss got in the SUV. The driver closed the door with one clean motion. The vehicle moved back through the range gate at the same unhurried pace it had arrived, raising a low tail of red dust that the wind pulled apart before it got 20 meters. Cole turned back to his trainees, who had all found reasons to be looking elsewhere. He called the next shooter to the line. The trainees broke for lunch at 11:45. Red Mesa's dining facility was a low concrete building on the administrative side of the complex. Functional, air-conditioned, and perpetually smelling of the industrial coffee maker that ran 18 hours a day. Cole usually ate at the range during orientation weeks, taking 20 minutes in his vehicle with a sandwich and paperwork. Today, he found himself in the dining facility for the first time in 3 weeks, carrying a tray he'd loaded without looking at and sitting at the end of a table near the back wall. Around him, the trainees ate and talked. He listened to enough of it to confirm what he'd already known. That the morning's events had become the conversation, were probably going to be the conversation for the rest of this intake cycle, might be the conversation for intake cycles after this one. He heard his own name twice in contexts that didn't require finishing the sentence to understand the meaning. He ate his food and didn't look up. He was halfway through a sandwich he couldn't taste when someone set a tray down across from him and sat. He looked up. Evelyn Cross looked back at him. She'd gotten a coffee and what appeared to be 2 pieces of cornbread, which she was eating with the deliberate practicality of someone fueling a machine rather than enjoying a meal. Cole set his sandwich down. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The dining facility moved around them. Trays, conversation, the screech of a chair being pulled back 2 tables over. "You didn't have to sit here," Cole said finally. "I know." She broke off a piece of cornbread. "You want to ask me something?" "Lot of things." "Then ask." Cole had spent the 2 hours since 09:30 thinking, on and off, about which question to start with. He'd assembled and discarded half a dozen. Sitting across from her now, none of the polished ones came. What came instead was the raw version. "How long have you been doing this?" She looked at him. "Shooting?" "Coming into facilities like this. Playing the observer who isn't an observer." Something crossed her face. Not quite amusement, not quite the opposite. "I'm not playing anything. I'm here for a program evaluation, same as the documentation says." "The documentation also says you're a coordinator." "I am a coordinator." "For what?" She drank her coffee and didn't answer immediately. It wasn't evasion. It had more the quality of a person deciding how much of a true thing to say. "A qualification program," she said, "for a specific skill set. I'm here to evaluate whether your facility's training outputs are meeting certain standards." "Standards set by who?" "People above your admiral's pay grade." Cole absorbed that. "And the rifle?" "What about it?" "That setup, the chassis. I don't recognize the optic." "Most people don't." "Where's it from?" She broke off the second piece of cornbread and ate it. Didn't answer. "The shot," Cole said. 2 rounds, same hole, 1,500 meters, with a rifle you told me wasn't zeroed to this range. He leaned forward a fraction. "Talk to me about the wind call." Something changed in her expression, barely perceptible. A slight adjustment in attention, like a door opening an inch. She looked at him as though reassessing something. 6 knots was the reported condition, she said. At the surface. It was running about 4.5 at distance, different direction. The thermals over the berm between the 1,000 and 1,200 meter marks were pushing slightly left between 0.850 and 0.920. So any shooter who used the reported condition without accounting for the gradient was going to run approximately 2 to 3 inches right at 1,500. Cole thought about his own 5th shot. 1,300 meters, 2 inches right. He didn't say anything. "You'd need a second observation point to catch it properly," she said. "Or enough time downrange to have mapped it yourself beforehand." She took a sip of coffee. I got here at 0520. Cole blinked. This morning? Yes. He stared at her. The range doesn't open until 0600. The range opens for scheduled personnel at 0600. She set the coffee down. The range road opens at 0500 to credentialed vehicles. Which mine is? She had arrived 2 hours before the intake group and spent 90 minutes downrange before anyone else got there. Mapping conditions, gathering data. Not for the competition. There'd been no competition planned, no reason to anticipate one, just because that was what she did. That was what she considered preparation. Cole sat back. He thought about the 90 minutes she'd spent under the canopy before he'd walked over to her. The torque wrench. The slow, deliberate calibration. The notebook. She hadn't been maintaining the rifle. She'd been dialing it to a zero she'd already established in the 2 hours before anyone arrived. The maintenance work was real, but it was also the last step in a preparation sequence that had started before dawn. And when he'd walked over to challenge her, she'd been finishing the final adjustment on a rifle she'd already sighted in. The competition he'd set up to humiliate her had been, from her side, approximately as challenging as being asked to demonstrate something she'd already done. Cole picked up his sandwich, put it down again. You didn't say any of that, he said. You didn't ask. I called you a gear mechanic in front of 43 people. I know. That doesn't bother you. She looked at him directly, not with heat, not with performance, just steadily. What do you want me to say to that, Master Sergeant? He didn't have an answer. People say things, she said. They say a lot of things. I've stopped organizing my energy around what people say. She picked up her tray. I organize it around what the situation actually requires. She stood. Good luck with your 1400, she said. She carried her tray to the return window, set it down, and walked out of the dining facility without looking back. Cole sat at the table and finished his sandwich, and tasted none of it. The 1,400 with Rear Admiral Voss lasted 53 minutes. Cole had spent the lunch hour pulling his range logs for the current quarter and the intake personnel files for the present group, organizing them in the way that administrative reviews generally preferred. Chronological, clearly labeled, nothing buried. He'd done this kind of preparation often enough that the mechanical routine of it was almost comforting. Paper in order. Answers ready. Whatever came next, at least the documentation was clean. The meeting was in the facility commander's conference room, a space that was used so rarely for its intended purpose that it permanently smelled of the cleaning solution applied to it before visitors. Voss was already seated when Cole arrived. So was Major Francis Alcott, the facility's executive officer, who had the expression of someone who'd received a phone call earlier in the day that she hadn't enjoyed. Cole set his files on the table and sat down. Voss didn't look at the files. I'm going to give you an accurate picture of what happened this morning, he said, not to assign blame, to make sure you understand the parameters you're working in. He folded his hands on the table. Chief Warrant Officer Cross is assigned to the Operational Evaluation Division, which coordinates qualification standards for certain precision specialties across multiple service branches and federal agencies. Her work is classified at a level that I'm not going to specify in this room. She travels under a cover profile, the Observer Coordinator designation, because her actual assignment would create operational security problems if it were widely known. He paused. She is also one of approximately 6 people in this country who consistently shoots at the level you saw this morning, in any condition, with any supported equipment, at any distance she's given enough time to dial for. Alcott made a small sound that wasn't quite a word. The program she's evaluating, Voss continued, was designed in part to address a gap in the way facilities like this one identify and develop precision talent. Part of that evaluation involves observing how training staff respond to shooters whose profile doesn't match their expectations. He looked at Cole without blinking. You failed that portion of the evaluation at approximately 0730 this morning. Cole kept his face level. Understood, sir. You called her a gear mechanic. Yes, sir. In front of the intake group. Yes, sir. Voss was quiet for a moment. I'm not here to conduct a punitive review. That's not what this is. But I'm going to require you to participate in 3 days of remedial instruction as part of the evaluation follow-up protocol. That instruction will be delivered by Chief Cross, starting tomorrow at 0600. The room was very still. Cole processed what he'd just heard. Instruction delivered by Chief Cross. starting tomorrow. Sir, he said, and his voice came out professionally, which cost him. Understood. Major Alcott will coordinate the administrative side. Voss picked up his cover from the table and stood. One more thing, Master Sergeant. Sir? The intake group you're running this week. They saw everything that happened this morning, everything. He looked at Cole for a long beat. What they take away from it is, to a meaningful extent, still up to you. What you do in the next 72 hours will matter more than what happened in the last 3. He left without waiting for a response. Alcott sat across from Cole and they looked at each other for a moment across the table. 3 days, she said. Not sympathetically, just factually, the way you acknowledge weather. Yes, ma'am. She stood and gathered her notes. She requested access to Range 4 for tomorrow's session. I approved it. She paused at the door. Range 4 is where we run the advanced problem sets. Wind tunnel conditions, steel at 2,000 meters, the moving target system. She looked at him. I assumed she knew what she was requesting. Yes, ma'am, Cole said. I think she does. Alcott left. Cole sat alone in the conference room for a while, with his clean files in front of him and the cleaning solution smell all around him, and looked at the far wall and thought about a woman who had arrived at 05:20 in the morning with a rifle she'd already sighted and a wind map she'd already built, and had sat under a canopy for 2 hours waiting for a day to begin. He thought about what kind of career produced that kind of preparation. What kind of experience made that the baseline rather than the extraordinary? He thought about the pause before the last shot. 3 seconds. Maybe 4. Not hesitation. The opposite. The specific stillness of someone for whom the question of whether they could do it had been settled so long ago they didn't carry it anymore. What remained was only the question of whether the conditions were exactly right, and how to make them so. He thought about 6 people in the country. He thought about the work that sat behind a sentence like that. He drove home at 1700 and ate dinner alone and went to bed at 2100 with his range log open on the kitchen table to the entry for the morning session. He'd written the standard notations: conditions, participants, stage scores, incidents. In the incident field, he'd written informal precision demonstration, observer personnel, results anomalous. See scoring sheet. He stared at anomalous for a long time. It wasn't the right word. He knew what anomalous meant. Outside the expected range, inconsistent with the data set. What he'd seen this morning was not outside the expected range for Evelyn Cross. For her, it was probably the median. The normal Tuesday. The unremarkable execution of something she'd done enough times that her hands did it without committee. What was anomalous was that he'd been on the same range for 11 years without knowing that people like her existed. He closed the log. She was at range 4 when he arrived at 05:45. He'd left the house at 05:10, told himself it was because he wanted to review the range layout before the session started. Knew as he was saying it to himself that the real reason was that he didn't want to be the one who arrived second again. He made it to range 4 by 05:42, which felt, in some small and privately embarrassing way, like a minor victory. She was already there, not at the firing line. She was 40 meters downrange, crouched near one of the berm markers, with what appeared to be a handheld weather station in one hand and a notepad in the other. She was writing something, checked the weather station, wrote something else. She hadn't looked up when he came through the range gate. Cole stood at the equipment bay and set his bag down and watched her work. She was in the same plain field fatigues as yesterday. No rank, no unit. She'd tied her hair back in a way that was purely functional, not neat, just controlled, pulled out of the way. She was wearing knee pads, the worn kind with the foam compacted from actual use, not the kind people wore for pictures. She finished her notation, stood, checked the weather station one more time, pocketed it, and started walking back toward the firing line. She covered the 40 meters at a pace that wasn't slow but wasn't hurried, the walk of someone in transit between tasks rather than on display. She reached the firing line, nodded at him once. Barrett, she said. Cross. She set her notepad on the equipment table and looked at it for a moment. Cole couldn't see the writing from his angle. How much do you know about reading mid-range thermals? She asked. General principle? I've worked the databook method, standard gradient tables. Okay. She turned and looked downrange. That's a starting point. What the standard tables miss is what happens between the 800 and 1200 meter marks on a range with this terrain profile. You've got a dry wash running parallel to the range at about 950 meters. It creates a convective cell that shifts in the morning and in the late afternoon. The tables don't account for it because it's site-specific. Cole looked downrange. He'd run this range hundreds of times. He'd never thought about what was happening at the 950 meter mark. "How did you find it?" he asked. "Walked the range." "When?" "Yesterday afternoon, after the dining facility." He stared at her. She picked up her notebook. "You were at the 1400 until around 1455. I had time." She said it simply, without emphasis, the way you say things that are just the account of what happened. No performance of diligence, no expectation that he'd be impressed. Just, "I had time, so I used it." Cole had been an instructor for 11 years. He had trained people who were technically proficient, people who were tactically sound, people who were physically capable and mentally tough and highly motivated. He had occasionally trained people who were exceptional. He had never trained anyone who thought like this. The thought arrived with a quality that was difficult to name, something between professional recognition and a more complicated private reckoning that he wasn't fully ready to have in this moment. He set it aside, the way you set something fragile down when you're not in a position to be careful with it. "What's on the schedule?" he said. She looked at him, and something in her expression shifted slightly. The assessment quality, the measuring look she'd given him in the dining facility, was there again, but different now. Narrower, more specific. "Today we're not shooting," she said. Cole blinked. "The session is observation and data collection." She turned back to the range. "You can't solve a problem you haven't correctly identified. Your facility's training outputs are underperforming in precision assessment at long range. That's a documented pattern across the last 3 intake cycles. Before I can tell you what needs to change, I need to understand why you see what you see when you look at a shooter." She pulled a chair from the equipment table and positioned it behind the primary bench, slightly offset, facing the range. "Sit," she said. Cole sat. He was aware that this was the position he occupied for the trainees he was evaluating, behind and to the side, watching. He was aware that the inversion was intentional. "We're going to have 6 of your trainees run their first long-range stage this morning," she said. "While they shoot, I want you to narrate your observations to me, out loud. What you see, what you assess, what you'd correct." She sat in her own chair beside the equipment table, notebook open. "I'm not grading you on the content. I'm listening to how you look." Cole turned this over. "How I look?" "At a shooter, what you prioritize, what you notice first." She looked at him. "What you miss." It was the last 2 words that landed differently than the rest. He turned to face the range. "The first trainee will be here at 0600, he said. "I know." She uncapped her pen. 4 minutes. The morning light was coming in flat and hard from the eastern ridge, the way it did at Red Mesa. Not golden, not picturesque, just honest. It put everything in clear relief and softened nothing. The target stakes at distance threw short shadows. The steel plates were cold still, not yet warm to the temperature that would start radiating heat shimmer by mid-morning. Cole looked at the range, tried to see it the way she'd described. The wash at 950 meters, the convective cell, the thermal shift. Tried to see past what he'd been looking at for 11 years to what was actually happening in the space between the firing line and the targets. He heard the gate open behind him. Footsteps on the access road. The first trainee arriving. He didn't turn around yet. "Cross," he said. She was writing something, didn't look up. "Barrett, the program evaluation." He paused. "What's the actual standard? The thing you're measuring against?" She finished her notation, set the pen down. "Whether your people can identify talent when it doesn't look like what they expect it to look like," she said. "Whether the training environment selects for ability or selects for presentation." She picked the pen back up. "Those are different things," she said, "and most facilities can't tell the difference." The footsteps on the access road got closer. Cole looked at the range, at the flat, hard light, at the distance where the dry wash cut through the terrain at 950 meters and created a convective pattern he'd been standing next to for 11 years without knowing it was there. He thought about what else he didn't know was there. He thought about 6 people in the country and what separated them from everyone else, and whether the separation was ability or whether it was, at least in part, the quality of attention they'd brought to 11,000 mornings before this one. The gate clanged behind him. "First shooter," she said quietly without looking up. "Your call." Cole turned around. And whatever he'd been before 0730 yesterday morning, whatever version of himself he'd operated as for 11 years on this range, loud and certain and calibrated to a worldview that had just been quietly taken apart and left in pieces on the desert floor, he set it down. Not completely, not all at once. That wasn't how these things worked, and he knew it, but enough. "Shoot her up," he called. "Let's go." The first trainee to the line that morning was a federal contractor named Gideon Marsh. Cole knew him from the intake paperwork. 31 years old, former Army infantry, 2 combat deployments, currently cycling through a federal law enforcement qualification track that required a precision marksmanship endorsement. His file said he'd shot expert on his last military qualification, which in Cole's experience meant approximately nothing about what a man could do at distance under conditions that didn't come with a fixed schedule and a standardized target array. Marsh arrived at Range 4 at 0601, 1 minute late, with the slightly self-conscious energy of someone who'd been told the session was remedial and hadn't decided yet how to feel about that. He was built wide through the shoulders, moved with the residual physicality of someone who'd spent years in a profession that valued mass and forward momentum. He set his kit bag down, looked at Cole, looked at the woman sitting beside the equipment table with a notebook, and looked back at Cole. "Ma'am," he said, in the direction of Evelyn Cross. She didn't look up. "Set up on the primary bench. I'll tell you when to load." Marsh blinked. He looked at Cole again. Cole pointed at the bench. Marsh went to the bench. What followed over the next 4 hours was unlike any training session Cole had run or participated in at Red Mesa, and he'd been part of several hundred. Cross didn't run the group through a stage. She ran them through a sequence of observation problems, each shooter set up on a target of their choice, at a distance of their choice, and then talked through their win call, their position decision, their pre-shot routine, out loud, in real time, while she and Cole listened. She asked no leading questions. She made no corrections during the narration. She let each shooter finish, wrote something in her notebook, and then, only then, asked one question. The questions were always different, and they were always the question the shooter hadn't expected. To Marsh, after he'd run a thorough and technically confident win call for a 1,200-meter target, "What's your heart rate right now, approximately?" Marsh frowned. I'm not tracking that. Estimate? Maybe 70, 75? Okay. She wrote something. "What does your heart rate do when you're 48 hours into a field evolution, no sleep, ambient temperature differential of 30 degrees from your daytime baseline, and someone is telling you through your earpiece that the window is closing?" Marsh looked at her. "That's what the stage is actually measuring for," she said. "Not the technical platform. The platform is table stakes." She moved to the next shooter. Cole stood behind and to the left of the line, in the position she'd put him in, and watched, and narrated. He'd been uncomfortable with it at first. Talking through his observations out loud while she wrote them down felt like a performance review in real time, which it was, and which he'd known it was, and which didn't make it more comfortable, but somewhere in the second hour the discomfort had shifted into something closer to focused attention. Because what she was doing with his narration was not what he'd expected. She wasn't marking him wrong. She was showing him where his language stopped. He'd say something like, "Shooter's position is solid, natural point of aim looks good," and she'd make a note and ask, "What's his jaw doing?" And Cole would look and realize that Marsh's jaw was set in a way that meant he was bracing, not against the recoil, but against something he was anticipating that hadn't happened yet, some preloaded tension he was carrying into the shot, and that it would cost him 2 inches at distance every time, and that he, Cole, had not seen it because he'd stopped looking at the jaw once he'd confirmed the shoulders. She was showing him the gap between what he looked at and what he saw. By 10:30, Cole had stopped narrating for her benefit and started narrating for his own. She noticed. Didn't say anything, just made a slightly different kind of note. At 10:45, with the last of the 6 trainees completing their observation stage, she closed her notebook and looked at the range for a moment. "Break until 1300, she said. "This afternoon we're shooting." The afternoon session was different in temperature and different in character. The heat had built through the midday to the kind that turned the air visible over the steel plates at distance, and the wind off the western ridgeline had picked up and gone variable, shifting between 4 and 9 knots in patterns that had no reliable periodicity. It was, Cole recognized, approximately the worst condition set you could get at Red Mesa outside of an active dust event. Not impossible to shoot in, but the kind of conditions where the gap between a technically competent shooter and an excellent one became measurable in ways that the range score made impossible to argue with. He suspected she'd been watching the weather all day and had timed the afternoon session accordingly. The trainees shot in pairs, alternating, with Cole on one relay and Cross moving between positions, observing, occasionally crouching behind a shooter for 30 seconds to look over their shoulder and then standing and moving on without a word. She wasn't coaching during the strings, she was collecting something, data, pattern, whatever the word was for what she was building toward. Cole ran his relay cleanly. He'd slept badly, and the 1,400 with Voss sat somewhere in the back of his mind in the way that things sit when they're not resolved yet. And his own shooting in the morning observation stage had not been as clean as he'd wanted. He'd talked himself into a wind call he hadn't trusted and paid for it with a cold shot that went 8 inches wide at 1,400 meters, which was the kind of miss that would have been invisible in his usual training context and was, in this context, exactly the kind of thing she was there to document. He corrected the second string and hit clean through the back half of the stage and told himself that was what mattered. He wasn't certain he believed it. At 14:30, while the last pair was shooting and Cole was at the scoring table reviewing the morning's observation data, his radio crackled. Not the range radio. His personal unit. The encrypted channel that the facility used for administrative and emergency communication. The channel that almost nobody used during training hours because it was protocol. The training hours were training hours and everything else waited. He pulled the radio from his kit. Barrett? The voice on the other end was Specialist Dugan's, but Dugan's voice had a quality in it that didn't fit the afternoon. Tight, stripped of the practice neutrality he usually kept on any channel. Master Sergeant, you need to come to the main range. Now. I'm in the middle of a session, Dugan. Sir? A half-second pause. I'm aware. You still need to come. Cole looked at the range. Cross was crouched behind the second trainee in the current pair, watching through a spotter's monocular. The string was running. What is it? 2 vehicles came through the outer gate about 15 minutes ago, Dugan said. They had credentials. I checked them and they checked, so I let them through. They've been on range 2 with 3 shooters for the last 12 minutes. Another pause. One of the shooters is Jacoby. Cole went still. Warren Jacoby. Range Master First Class, Red Mesa's senior firearms instructor and the facility's highest-rated precision shooter on the official roster. 13 years on site. Jacoby and Cole had what could charitably be called a complicated professional relationship. They occupied overlapping authority in overlapping areas and had spent the better part of a decade navigating that with varying success. More relevantly, Jacoby had been on approved leave this week, which was why Cole had been running the orientation intake. Why is Jacoby back? Cole said. A longer pause. He's running a competing evaluation, Dugan said. He's got a team from the Meridian Group on range 2. They've been shooting, and I think... Dugan stopped, started again. Sir, I think they know about yesterday. Cole lowered the radio. He looked at the range again. The string had finished. Cross had stood from her crouch and was making a notation. The late afternoon light was coming in hard from the west now, casting everything in relief. Equipment tables, target stakes, the red dust drifting off the berm. He raised the radio. Stay on your post. Don't engage them. Master Sergeant, I'm on my way. He told Cross as briefly as he could. She listened without expression, which was her way, but something in the quality of her stillness shifted. The same small change he'd noticed in the dining facility when she'd made a decision about how much of a true thing to say. She was processing something she hadn't anticipated, and she was doing it fast. Meridian Group, she said, private tactical consulting firm. They've done contract work with the facility before. I know what they are. She closed her notebook. How long has Jacoby been running with them? Cole looked at her. You know Jacoby. I know of him. She picked up her kit bag. He's tried to get in front of the evaluation program twice in the last 18 months. Different facility, same angle. Running a parallel assessment and pushing the output metrics to the program director as a competing methodology. She said this without any particular heat, just the flat precision of someone reciting documented fact. He didn't get traction either time. Because? She looked at him. Because his methodology selects for presentation. Cole absorbed that. You told me most facilities can't tell the difference, he said. Most can't. But you can. Yes. She was already moving toward the range gate. Cole fell in beside her. What's the play? He said. There's no play. I'm going to go look at what they're doing. If it's legitimate range use with properly credentialed visitors, it's legitimate range use. She didn't slow down. And if it's something else, I'll know that too. They came through the Range 4 gate onto the connector road that ran between the facility's numbered ranges. Range 2 was 300 meters north, and as they covered that distance, Cole could hear it. The intermittent crack of large caliber fire, precise and widely spaced in the way that precision long-range shooting was. Each shot separated from the next by the time it took to work the bolt, reacquire, and make a new decision. Someone was running a long-range string on Range 2, and whoever it was had a consistent cadence that spoke to real technical ability, which meant Jacoby had brought someone good. Cole had known Jacoby for 9 years, had eaten meals with him, argued with him over range doctrine, deferred to him in specific areas, and been deferred to in others. He didn't like Jacoby, had never quite liked him, had maintained a professional relationship with him because the facility required it, and because Cole was practical enough to separate what he felt from what the job needed. But he knew Jacoby's capabilities, and he knew Jacoby's instincts, and what his instincts told him now was that Jacoby had come back from leave for a reason, and that reason was standing beside him on the connector road. They rounded the northern berm, and Range 2 opened up ahead of them. 2 black vehicles parked near the equipment bay, not government plates, civilian, but with a particular configuration of antennas and tinted glass that told a story about the organization behind them. 3 men in tactical gear at the far end of the equipment area, 2 of them setting up spotting positions, the third prone behind a rifle on the primary bench. 60 meters from the vehicles, near the range officer station, Warren Jacoby stood with 2 men Cole didn't recognize, both in civilian clothes, watching the shooter through their own spotting equipment. Jacoby was 44, lean and deliberate, with a face that communicated calm expertise in the way that certain faces did. Not handsome, not arresting, just utterly confident in its own proportions. He turned when he heard them come through the range access point, and his expression ran through a sequence that lasted about 1 second. Surprise, recalibration, something that might have been satisfaction badly concealed, before settling into professional neutrality. Barrett, he said, didn't expect you out here. Didn't expect you back, Cole said. You're on approved leave through Friday. Leave got cut short. He said it lightly, the way you say things you want to sound incidental. Administrative need. His eyes moved across, stayed there. Ma'am. Rangemaster Jacoby, she said. Something in the way she used his title and his name together had a quality that Cole couldn't quite characterize. Not cold, not deferential, just precisely calibrated, like a measurement delivered to the exact significant figure required, and not one beyond it. I'd heard you were running an evaluation block here this week, Jacoby said. Program evaluation? Yes. I've been following the program, the OED methodology. He turned slightly toward the 2 men beside him. My colleagues here have some interest in the evaluation framework. They had questions about how the qualification standards are set and who's making that determination. Those are questions for the program director, Cross said, which I'm not. No, Jacoby said, but you're the one actually running the evaluation. The man at the firing bench had paused his string. He was looking back at them, big, deliberate, with the patient attention of a man who'd been shooting long enough to know when the environment around him was more relevant than the target in front of him. Who's your shooter? Cole asked. Jacoby smiled slightly. Marcus Reede, contract specialist. He's been running the program's distance standards as a comparative baseline. Whose authorization for range access? Cross asked. Major Alcott approved the visit this morning. Something moved across Cole's thinking, quick and unpleasant. He'd been in sessions with Cross since 0600. Alcott had approved a competing visit to Range 2 at some point during the day without telling him, which either meant Alcott didn't consider it something he needed to know, or meant something else that he didn't want to name yet. Cross looked at the shooter on the bench, looked at the target line, looked back at Jacoby. "What standards has he been running?" she said. "Distance qualification sequence, 800 to 2,000 meters. Mixed steel." Jacoby produced a tablet from under his arm and turned it toward her. "Scores are on here. He's running clean, 91% hit rate across 4 complete strings." Cross looked at the tablet for a moment without taking it. "What's the wind been doing on this range today?" she said. Jacoby blinked. "Range officer has the data." "I'm asking you." "A beat." "Variable. The afternoon shift brought it up to 6-7 knots." "The afternoon shift brought it up to a variable 4 to 9 with an inconsistent heading change every 3 to 7 minutes, Cross said. 91% at 2,000 meters in those conditions is either a very good score or a managed one. She looked at the scoring tablet again. "What target size at 2,000? Jacoby's expression didn't move. "Standard steel." "Standard steel at Red Mesa is a 24-inch plate," Cole said. "That's correct." Cross turned and looked at him. "The OED distance qualification at 2,000 meters uses a 16-inch plate." The quiet that followed had a particular texture to it, the kind that comes when something that was implicit has been made explicit, and there's no reasonable way to pretend otherwise. Jacoby's jaw tightened slightly. The OED standard isn't the only valid methodology. It's the one this evaluation is benchmarking against, which is a decision made by the program director, who I think would benefit from understanding that there are alternative frameworks that produce strong results. Then make that argument to the program director. "I'm making it to you." Cross looked at him for a moment, looked at the tablet, looked at the shooter on the bench, who had sat up fully now and was watching the conversation with the patient attention of someone waiting for instructions. "You want a comparison?" she said. Jacoby didn't answer, but something in his expression, a tightening around the eyes, a slight reorientation of attention, gave away that this was, in fact, exactly what he wanted. A direct comparison on his range, with his shooter, with the scores visible to his colleagues. A controlled demonstration that he could point to afterward. Cole saw it, and he suspected Cross saw it too. "Set up a 2,000-meter stage," she said. 16-inch plate, same wind, both your shooter and me. Jacoby looked at her for just a moment longer than was comfortable. "That's not what I—" "You want to demonstrate that your framework produces equivalent results," she said. "So demonstrate it. Same conditions, same standard, same distance." The two men in civilian clothes looked at each other. Cole couldn't read their expressions. They were the particular kind of carefully non-committal faces that suggested they were there primarily to observe and evaluate, not to participate, and that they were currently evaluating this moment very carefully. Jacoby looked at his shooter. Rita from the bench gave a small shrug. It was the shrug of a man who was good enough at his job to know what he was being asked to do and was willing to do it. "Fine," Jacoby said. "Let's set it up." Specialist Dugan appeared at the range boundary at some point in the setup period, drawn by some instinct common to range personnel who can tell when something significant is about to happen on their facility. He positioned himself near the scoring table with the expression of a man attending an event he hadn't paid for and wasn't sure he was supposed to be at. The 16-inch plate went up at 2,000 meters. Jacoby's men had to reposition the target carrier, which took 12 minutes and which nobody spoke much during. Cross used the time to sit at the equipment table with her notebook open, writing nothing, watching the ridgeline to the west where the wind was coming from. Cole watched her. She was reading something in the air, not literally, not in any mystical sense, just watching the way the dust moved at the range boundary and the way the heat shimmer shifted between the 1,200 and 1,500 meter marks, and building a picture from the data. She'd done this before. Not this specific range, not this specific afternoon, but this. The thing of sitting with a problem and letting the problem come to her rather than imposing a solution onto it before she understood what she was looking at. Cole recognized it now as the same quality she'd brought to the torque wrench that first morning. Not slowness, but patience. The specific patience of someone who'd learned the cost of rushing. Rita shot first. He was good. Cole had known he would be. Jacoby wouldn't have brought anyone who wasn't. And watching him work through the pre-shot sequence was like watching competence rendered into a physical process. He was measured, unhurried, technically sound. He made a wind call that Cole, looking at the current conditions, thought was reasonable but slightly conservative. He shot the 5-round string with clean bolt work and a consistent cadence. 3 hits, 2 misses. The misses were both left, both caught by the same wind shift that had changed heading during the string. 60% at 2,000 meters on a 16-inch plate in variable conditions, which was actually a respectable score. Cole knew that, and he suspected the men in civilian clothes knew that because they didn't react as though it was bad. They just wrote things down. Jacoby looked at Cross. She was already moving to the bench. And here was the thing that Cole would think about afterward, replaying the sequence the way you replay things that matter. The thing that happened wasn't spectacular, not visually, not in the way that movie versions of this moment looked. She went prone, settled, adjusted nothing because whatever she'd decided during the setup period was already decided, and went still. Still in the specific way he'd watched her be still twice now. The particular kind that made everything in your peripheral vision seem louder because the thing you were watching had gone quiet in a way that most things never did. She waited through one wind cycle, 30 seconds, maybe 35. Nobody spoke. The range was hot and the wind was doing what it had been doing all afternoon, shifting, dropping, picking back up, unpredictable in period but not in range, staying between 4 and 9 and always going back to the heading it had been, averaging since 1400. She shot inside a window. The break of the first shot was so clean that Cole almost missed the recoil impulse. The rifle moved and came back to 0 before his eyes registered that the shot had broken. The ring from 2,000 meters came back on the wind 3 seconds later. Hit. She worked the bolt. Waited again. Not long. 7 seconds. 8. The next window. Shot 2. Hit. The cadence she was running was nothing like Reed's. His had been mechanical, consistent, the regular pulse of someone executing a practiced routine. Hers was irregular. Long pause, short pause, long, then 2, almost back to back. And the irregularity was information. She was shooting the wind, not the clock. Each shot was timed to a specific moment she'd identified and waited for, and the identification was happening live, in real time, reading the air off of the ridgeline and the heat shimmer at mid-range and whatever other input she was pulling from the environment that Cole was only beginning to understand you could read if you knew what to look for. Shot 3. Hit. Shot 4. The wind shifted, not slightly. It rotated a full 20 degrees in about 4 seconds, the kind of heading change that happened once or twice in an afternoon at this range. Unpredictable, no warning. Cole saw it in the dust at the range boundary and knew that if the shot broke in the next few seconds, it would pull left and miss. She didn't shoot. The pause extended. Jacoby shifted his weight. One of the civilian men moved his spotting scope slightly. Dugan, at the scoring table, stopped writing. 8 seconds. 10. 12. The wind came back. She shot. Hit. Shot 5 broke 4 seconds after shot 4. Hit 5 rounds. 5 hits. A 16-inch plate at 2,000 meters, in a variable 4 to 9 knot condition with a mid-string heading change that had made the 4th shot's window close and then reopen. 5 for 5. Rada, 3 feet to her left, sat up from his own spotting position where he'd been watching through a monocular. He looked at the target board where Dugan had the hit count posted. He looked at the back of Evelyn Cross's head as she cleared her rifle. He made a sound, not a word, just a sound. The specific kind a person makes when they've seen something and their throat registers it before their brain has the words. Cross stood, cleared the rifle, applied the safety, and set it down. She turned to Jacoby. He was looking at her with an expression that Cole had not seen on Warren Jacoby's face in 9 years, an expression he'd have said was outside Jacoby's range. The flat, involuntary look of someone who has been handed a correct answer to a question they'd spent a long time being certain about. Your shooter is technically proficient, she said. He's running a solid methodology. At the standard that was actually being tested to a 24-inch plate at 2,000, he'd have clean scores. She looked at the tablet, still under Jacoby's arm, then back at his face. What he's not doing, and what your framework doesn't train for, is reading the problem. He's executing a preloaded solution. When the conditions match the solution, the scores look right. When they don't, she glanced at the target line. They don't. Nobody said anything. The program isn't selecting against your methodology, she said. It's selecting against any methodology that stops at the technical level and calls it done. Jacoby looked at the target board, looked at his shooter, looked at the two men in civilian clothes who had the particular quality of people who'd gotten an answer they needed and were ready to leave. "We'll review the data," Jacoby said, finally. "That's fine," Cross said. She picked up her kit bag and her notebook and walked back toward the range access gate without a dramatic pause, without a closing line, without the beat that would have made the moment theatrical. She just went, the way she did everything, with the quiet economy of someone who had done what the situation required and was already moving to whatever came next. Cole watched her go. He looked at Jacoby, who was still looking at the target board. Rita was at the bench, breaking down his equipment with the careful motions of someone doing something with their hands because they need something to do. The two civilian men were talking quietly to each other in voices too low to carry. Dugan appeared at Cole's elbow. "Master Sergeant," he said quietly. "Yeah." "The 5 for 5. Dugan paused. Is that what she does? Like, routinely?" Cole watched Cross disappear around the north berm. He thought about a woman who arrived at a range at 0520 and walked the course before anyone else was awake, who spent 90 minutes downrange building a data picture of conditions that would tell her, 5 hours later, exactly when to pull a trigger, who had sat in a dining facility and eaten cornbread and told him she had time, so she'd used it, as though this were the most unremarkable thing in the world, who had paused before the last shot on the day he'd challenged her, not because she was unsure, but because she was waiting for the moment she'd already decided she was going to wait for. "Yeah," Cole said. "I think it is." Dugan was quiet for a moment. "And you called her a gear monkey," he said. Cole looked at him. Dugan's expression was not unkind. It was the expression of a man stating a fact that both of them already knew and that was not going to get less true with time. "Yeah," Cole said. "I did." He turned and followed Cross around the north berm, leaving Range 2 and the sounds of Jacoby's team behind him, his footsteps steady on the hard-packed desert road, the late sun throwing his shadow long and thin ahead of him in the direction he was going. He caught up with her on the connector road. She wasn't walking fast, but she wasn't waiting for him either. She had her kit bag over one shoulder and her notebook under her arm, and she was looking at the western ridgeline the way she'd been looking at it all afternoon, reading something in it that he still didn't have the vocabulary to fully name. "Cross," he said. She slowed slightly. He came alongside her, and they walked for a few seconds without talking, the crunch of their boots on the hard-packed dirt, the only sound besides the wind pulling at the range flags behind them. "What happens now?" he said. "I finished the evaluation. With Jacoby back on site." "Jacoby being on site doesn't change the evaluation." She shifted the kit bag on her shoulder. "It changes the politics around the evaluation, which is a different problem." "Is it your problem?" She glanced at him. It became mine the moment his colleagues drove through the gate with a competing data set. They reached the fork in the connector road, left toward the main administrative complex, right toward Range 4, where the day's session had started. She stopped at the fork. "Who were those two men?" Cole asked. "Program oversight," she said, "from the funding side. They're the ones who decide whether the OED evaluation framework stays in place. They're part of that decision, yes." Cole looked back in the direction of Range 2. The sounds of Jacoby's team were gone now. They'd either wrapped the session or moved inside. "And Jacoby's been trying to replace your methodology with his for 18 months. His firm's methodology," she said. "There's a contract attached to it. Meridian Group does the training assessments, sets the qualification standards, runs the certification cycles." She paused. "It's worth about $4 million annually if they get the contract." Cole absorbed that. "So this was never about marksmanship," he said. "It was always about marksmanship," she said. "The contract is downstream of whoever controls the standard. Control what counts as qualified, and you control who gets certified and who doesn't." She looked at him. "Your facility has been running OED evaluation blocks for 3 years. If the methodology changes, your last 3 years of certification outputs get reviewed against the new standard. Some of those certifications get pulled. That affects my people. It affects a lot of people's people." She said it quietly, without drama, but the weight of it landed clearly. This wasn't an academic dispute about shooting methodology. It was a fight over who had the authority to decide what qualified looked like, and there was real institutional consequence for everyone downstream of that decision. Cole thought about what Voss had said in the conference room. What you do in the next 72 hours will matter more than what happened in the last 3. He was starting to understand the shape of what Voss had meant. "What do you need?" he said. She looked at him, a long, steady look, the measuring kind. Not suspicious, just thorough. "Why?" "Because you spent 2 days fixing the way I look at shooters, and I don't think you had to do that. I think you could have run your evaluation, written your report, and left. You did more than that." He held her gaze. "So, what do you need?" She was quiet for a moment. A real moment, not performance. "Voss is calling a formal review tomorrow morning," she said. 900 hours, main conference room. Jacoby's going to present his team's data from today's Range 2 session. I'll present the OED evaluation findings. She paused. "The oversight representatives will be there, and they'll choose between them. They'll make a recommendation to the program director." She looked at the ridgeline. "But recommendations from oversight usually land." "What does your evaluation show?" "What it always shows at facilities that have been running my block." She shifted the notebook under her arm. "Technical scores are adequate. Talent identification is underdeveloped. The training environment is selecting for certain kinds of presentation over certain kinds of ability, which means you're certifying people who perform well on standardized stages and missing people who'd perform better under real conditions." She paused. "Your facility isn't the worst I've seen. It's not the best either." "What about today? The remedial sessions?" Something in her expression changed slightly, a small adjustment that he'd have missed a day ago. "Today was different." "How?" She didn't answer immediately. Then, "Most instructors, when I put them in the observer position and ask them to narrate, they narrate what they think I want to hear. They self-censor. They perform competence instead of demonstrating it." She looked at him. "By the 3rd hour, you stopped doing that." Cole wasn't sure if that was a compliment or a clinical observation. With her, the line between the two was not always clear. "The jaw thing," he said. "That was the first one. There were others." She started walking again toward the administrative complex. "You're a good instructor, Barrett. You have been for a long time. The problem is, you built your standard around yourself." He walked beside her and didn't argue because it was true, and arguing with true things was a waste of time he'd been doing less of as the week progressed. "The report goes to the program director when?" he said. "End of the evaluation week. Friday." 2 days. "Yes." "And if Jacoby's people get to the oversight reps before then?" She stopped walking. Cole stopped beside her. She turned and looked at him with an expression that was, for the first time he'd seen, slightly less than entirely composed. Not distressed, not angry, just the face of someone who has been carrying something heavy for long enough that occasionally the weight becomes briefly visible. "Then I write an accurate report," she said, "and I submit it, and whatever happens after that isn't mine to control." She paused. "That's the job." She started walking again. Cole followed. The formal debrief for the day's sessions ran from 17:30 to 18:50 in the facility's secondary conference room. Smaller than the main one, no cleaning solution smell, just the functional austerity of a room that actually got used. Cross ran it, with Cole and Dugan present, and the 6 trainees from the morning's Range 4 session. She went through each shooter's data in sequence, observation notes, stage scores, the specific gaps she'd identified between their technical execution and their environmental reading. It was not comfortable, not because she was cruel about it. She wasn't. She delivered the assessments with the same flat precision she brought to everything. No temperature in it, just the content. But the content was honest. An honest assessment was something that Red Mesa's training culture had not, Cole was realizing with increasing clarity, made a consistent priority. Gideon Marsh sat across the table and heard that his technical platform was solid, and his environmental reading was essentially non-existent, that he was executing a preloaded solution every time instead of reading the problem in front of him, and that under field conditions, real ones, not standardized range conditions, this gap would cost him. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his jaw doing the thing Cole now knew to look for, and when she finished, he said, "How do I fix it?" Not defensive, not argumentative, just the direct question of someone who'd heard something true and wanted to know what to do about it. Cross looked at him for a moment. Practice reading before you shoot, she said. Not dope. Conditions. Spend time downrange without a rifle, just looking. Learn what the air is doing before you ask the rifle to tell you. She paused. Most shooters never do this because it doesn't produce an immediate score improvement. The improvement comes later, and by the time it comes, they've usually already decided they were shooting well enough. Marsh nodded, wrote something down. Cole watched this exchange and felt something that was complicated and didn't have a clean name. Recognition, maybe, of his own pattern in what she'd described. The thing you didn't learn because you were already performing adequately, and adequacy had felt, for a long time, like enough. The debrief ran through all 6 shooters. Each session left a specific residue. Not shame, or not exactly, but the particular discomfort of seeing yourself accurately from the outside. Cole had run hundreds of debriefs and delivered the same basic message about performance gaps and different packaging. What made this one different was that it was happening at the level where the gaps actually lived, not at the level where they were polished into digestible feedback. At 18:45, Cross closed her notebook. Tomorrow morning, she said, I need 2 of you to volunteer for an extended stage. Range 4, starting at 700. We're running the full OED distance sequence, 800 to 2,000 meters, 16-inch plate, variable conditions, no pre-briefed wind data. She looked around the table. You won't know the wind until you read it yourself. Silence. Then Marsh said, I'll go. A beat. The woman across from him, a federal law enforcement specialist named Dana Rourke, who'd been quiet through most of the debrief and whose scores had been the strongest in the morning's group, said, Second. Good. Cross stood. 700, bring your data books and leave your assumptions at the gate. The trainees filed out. Dugan left with them, and Cole heard him in the hallway outside saying something to Marsh in a low voice, Marsh's response inaudible through the door. Cole stayed in his seat. Cross was gathering her notes. She moved with the economy of someone ending a workday, not with any ceremony. Rourke, Cole said. She looked up. Donna Rourke. Her scores this morning were the cleanest in the group. I almost put her on the alternate list for the observation stage instead of one of the others. But you didn't. She was quiet. Didn't ask questions during orientation. He paused. I moved her to a less visible position. Cross looked at him steadily. I know, he said. I know. What made you notice it just now? You used Marsh's name in the debrief. You used everyone's name. You used Rourke's last. He paused. That was deliberate. Something shifted in her expression. Slight, but present. Not quite a smile. Something adjacent to it. Yes, she said. It was. She went back to gathering her notes. The way you run this, Cole said, the observation stage, the narration exercise, the questions you ask, you didn't develop this at a desk. She didn't answer. How long have you been in precision work? A pause. Not the kind that meant she wasn't going to answer, the kind that meant she was deciding how. 14 years active, she said. 3 before that in a different capacity. 17 years, roughly. He did the math. He'd put her at mid-30s, maybe late. Started young. Where'd you start? She picked up her notebook and looked at him, and the look had a quality that was different from the evaluative attention she'd turned on him in professional contexts. More personal, which for her probably meant about 30% less guarded than usual. You're asking about my record, she said. I'm asking about your experience. Same thing. Is it classified? Most of it. She paused. Enough of it. Cole leaned back in his chair. You said 6 people in the country shoot at your level. Voss said it, technically. Approximately. The number changes. What were you doing when you were at my level? She sat back down, not because she'd been moved to. It looked more like a decision she'd made, a small one, to give the question the weight it deserved. Qualification instructor, she said. Marine Corps, Camp Pendleton. I ran precision marksmanship training for 2 years before my first deployment cycle. What changed? I got deployed. She said it flatly. The first time changes things. The second time changes them more. She looked at the table surface. I had a spotter on my 3rd deployment. Name was Gregor Halm. He was better at the environmental read than anyone I've met before or since. He used to say the problem with good shooters is they're too confident about what they know. They spend all their time building certainty and none of it learning to be comfortable with uncertainty. She paused. He was right. Where's Holm now? A silence, brief but complete. He didn't come back from the 4th deployment, she said. Cole said nothing. There was nothing that wasn't inadequate. I took what he'd taught me, she said, and I spent 3 years trying to build it into a training methodology that could be passed on because that's what you do with what someone leaves you. She picked up the notebook again. That's the program. She stood. This time she was leaving. Cross, Cole said. She stopped. Tomorrow. The 0900 review. He paused. Jacoby's going to come in with clean numbers, controlled conditions. Reedy's scores will look strong against a different standard. I know. Voss will be there? Yes. Who else? The 2 oversight representatives. Jacoby. Probably Alcott. She looked at him. You, if you want to be there. Cole thought about what that meant. Being in the room where the decision was made, on which side of the table he'd be sitting, what it would cost him professionally to be visibly aligned with one position over another. Jacoby had 9 years of professional relationship behind him. The facility's internal politics ran through Jacoby in a dozen ways that Cole hadn't fully mapped until this week. He thought about Dana Rourke being moved to a less visible position because she was quiet and didn't ask questions. I'll be there, he said. No, he didn't sleep well. Not badly enough to be a story about it, just the ordinary poor sleep of a man with something unresolved sitting in his chest. He ran through the day twice in the dark of his quarters, the way his brain always processed things it hadn't finished with. And when he got up at 04:30 and couldn't make himself go back down, he made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with his range log and wrote out his observation notes from the day's sessions in more detail than the log technically required. He'd never done this before. The log had always been functional: conditions, scores, incidents, minimum viable documentation. What he wrote now was different. What Cross had asked him to do in the observer position, narrate what he saw, how he looked, what he prioritized, had created a habit in one day that he apparently couldn't switch off. He wrote about Marcia's jaw. He wrote about Rourke's scores and where he'd put her in the lineup. He wrote about the way he'd read the morning's group at 06:15 and the assumptions that reading had rested on. He wrote, I have been selecting for how people carry themselves, for confidence, for what I read as strength. I don't know when this became my standard instead of a byproduct of it. He looked at that sentence for a while. Then he wrote, Halm. Ask Cross more about the methodology origin if she's willing. He closed the log at 05:30 and got dressed and drove to the facility. He got to the main administrative complex at 6:10 and found, which did not surprise him, that Cross was already there. She was in the small planning room adjacent to the main conference room, a space with a long table and a whiteboard and no windows, used primarily for range scheduling. She had the whiteboard covered in handwritten notation, columns of data that Cole recognized as the evaluation findings, organized by trainee, by stage, by specific gap identified. Her laptop was open beside her and she was transferring information from it to the board with the focused efficiency of someone who'd been at it for a while. He knocked on the open door. She looked up. You're early, she said. So are you. I'm always early. She turned back to the board. He came in and looked at what she'd built. The columns were color-coded, blue for technical scores, red for environmental reading assessments, black for gap indicators. It was dense, but not chaotic. The logic of it was clear once you spent 30 seconds with it. Jacoby's going to have a cleaner visual, he said. Scores, percentages, simple. I know. Oversight reps respond to simple. I know that too. She added a notation to Rourke's column. Simple is easy to produce when you're controlling the conditions. I'm not going to produce a false simplicity just to compete with it. Even if it costs you the review. She set the marker down and turned to look at him. What would you have me do? Massage the data until it looks like what they want to see? No. Then what are you asking? Cole considered this. I'm asking if you've thought about how to present what you have in a way that doesn't give Jacoby room to say it's too complicated to scale. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the whiteboard. It was a long look. The kind that meant something was happening on the inside that wasn't visible on the outside. Some recalibration, some adjustment of approach. "Show me what you mean," she said. Cole came to the board. He looked at it for a minute, then picked up a blue marker from the tray. "The gap between technical scores and environmental reading," he said. "You've got them in separate columns, but the story is the difference between them." He drew a simple bracket across 3 trainees, Marsh, Rourke, and a third, whose scores showed the widest variance. "If I'm an oversight rep who's seen 500 performance datasets, I want to know one thing. What's your methodology finding that nothing else catches? Show me that gap. Make it the headline." She looked at what he'd drawn. "That's not how the OED report format is structured," she said. "That's not for the report," he said. "That's for the room." Another pause. "Voss already knows the methodology," she said, half to herself. "He doesn't need convincing. The oversight reps are the audience. And the oversight reps came here yesterday and watched Rita go 3 for 5 on a 16-inch plate at 2,000 meters, and then watched you go 5 for 5 in worse conditions." He set the marker down. "They have a visual in their heads already. You don't have to fight it. Connect it to what the data shows." She was quiet for almost 30 seconds. Then she picked up the red marker and moved to the board. She didn't redraw what he'd started. She built on it, fast, spare, pulling data from her columns and organizing it around the gap framework he'd outlined. She'd internalized what he'd pointed at and done something with it that was better than what he'd sketched, the way a builder does something better with a drawn line than the person who drew it. Cole watched her work and recognized the feeling. The specific satisfaction of having said something that turned into something better in someone else's hands. She finished in 11 minutes. The board looked different, same data, different shape. The story of what her evaluation had found was visible now in a way that didn't require a methodology briefing to access. "Better," he said. She stepped back and looked at it. "It's not wrong." "No. I don't like compressing the nuance." "You're not compressing it. You're sequencing it. The nuance is still in the report." She looked at the board for another moment. Then she put the cap back on the marker. "How are you doing this?" she said. Cole blinked. "I watched you run an intake group for 2 days and you were operating on a framework that had real gaps in it," she said. "Not unkindly, just accurately. And now you're telling me how to present evaluation data to oversight representatives." She looked at him. "That's a different skill set." "I've sat in a lot of administrative reviews," he said. 11 years at one facility, you learn how decisions get made in rooms." "That's not nothing." "No," he said. "It's not." She looked at the whiteboard. He looked at the whiteboard. The planning room was quiet around them, the facility not yet fully awake at 0630, the sounds of the desert morning coming through the building's exterior walls, faint, dry, the distant movement of wind. "Halm," Cole said. "Did he train anyone else the way he trained you?" She was quiet for a moment. "He tried. Most people weren't ready to sit with the uncertainty long enough to learn it." She paused. "He used to say you could tell in the first hour whether a shooter would ever get to the next level. Not by how well they shot, by how they responded when they didn't know something, whether they reached for a procedure or whether they got quiet and tried to actually read the problem." "What did you do?" "The second thing." She said it without pride, just fact. "It wasn't a virtue. I was uncomfortable with procedures because the procedures felt like they were answering a question about a situation that wasn't in front of me yet. The specificity bothered me." She paused. Halm said that was the thing, that the discomfort with the preloaded answer was the beginning of it. Cole thought about what Rita had done on Range 2. The clean, practiced execution of a preloaded solution, technically sound and contextually blind. Thought about what he'd been doing in his own training for 11 years, which was, he was now understanding, not entirely different. "What do I do with Rourke?" he said. Cross looked at him. "Tomorrow," he said, after the review, if I'm still running sessions." "What do I do with her?" "Put her in Range 4, Cross said. "Give her the problem set she was supposed to have today. And get out of the way." She paused. "The main thing she needs from you is to not be organized away from the difficult stage because she's quiet." "Understood." "Barrett." He looked at her. You asked what I need from you for the review. She held his gaze. I need you to tell the truth about what you observed in the sessions this week, including what you got wrong. Cole felt that land in the particular way things landed when they asked something real of you. Including the first morning, he said. Including the first morning. He nodded once. She turned back to the whiteboard. He went and got coffee from the facility kitchen and brought back 2 cups and set one on the table beside her without comment. She drank it without comment. They worked in the planning room until 08:15, when the sounds of the facility coming to life around them signaled that the morning had properly begun. At 8:55, Cole walked into the main conference room. Alcott was already seated, with the expression of a woman who'd spent the night regretting something and hadn't yet decided what to do about it. The 2 oversight representatives, Cole had learned their names from Dugan that morning. A man named Pressler and a woman named Tam were at the far end of the table with tablets open, and the specific quality of attention that belonged to people who held consequential authority and had learned to conceal how consequential it was. Jacoby was there. He was seated midway down the table in a position that was neither prominently at the head nor modestly at the side. The position of a man who'd thought about his positioning and made a choice. He had his own tablet and a printed summary document in a folder. He looked at Cole when Cole came in, and the look had a layer in it that was new. Not quite uncertainty, but the absence of the certainty that had been there at range 2. Voss entered at 08:58 and sat at the head of the table, and the room organized itself around him the way rooms did. Cross came in at 08:59. She had her notebook and a single printed sheet which she placed face down in front of her. She sat across from Jacoby, which Cole didn't think was accidental. At 0900, Voss looked around the table. Oh, this is an evaluation review, he said. Not a hearing, not a disciplinary session. The purpose is to assess the current evaluation block's findings and hear any relevant comparative data before the final report goes to the program director. He looked at both Jacoby and Cross. We'll hear from Master Sergeant Barrett first. Cole had not expected to go first. He'd thought about what he was going to say since the planning room, since the dark of his quarters at 04:30, since the moment in the dining facility when she'd told him the way she organized her energy. He'd thought about it across multiple iterations of preparation and discarded most of them. What he did was set down his range log and look at the table. I've been instructing at this facility for 11 years, he said. I've run a lot of intake groups and a lot of evaluation blocks, and I was confident before this week that I had a clear picture of what I was looking for in a shooter. He paused. I didn't. I had a clear picture of what a shooter looked like when they matched my expectations. That's not the same thing. He told them about the first morning, all of it, including the gear monkey remark, including the challenge, including what he'd read when he'd seen her under the canopy and what those readings said about where his standard actually lived. He told them about the observer position in range 4 and what he'd heard in his own narration as the morning had gone on. He told them about Rourke, moved to a less visible position because she was quiet. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Pressler, the male oversight rep, was looking at him with an expression that was impossible to read. Tam was writing something on her tablet. Thank you, Master Sergeant, Voss said. Cole sat back. Cross turned over her printed sheet and placed it in the center of the table. It was the whiteboard. Photographed and printed, the gap framework they'd built at 0630 clean and clear on the page. This is what the evaluation found, she said. 3 days of sessions, 43 participants across 2 range environments, she paused. The technical scores are adequate. The gap is in what those scores measure and what they miss. She talked for 12 minutes. Not long. Not with elaboration beyond what the data required. She described the gap between technical execution and environmental reading, described it in terms of operational relevance, and connected it, once clearly without belaboring, to what had happened on range 2 the previous afternoon. Jacoby listened. His expression was controlled. When she finished, he opened his folder. His presentation ran 18 minutes. It was polished. Cole would give him that. Clean numbers, clear progression, the Meridian Group methodology presented as rigorous and scalable, Rita's range 2 scores positioned as evidence that the approach produced results. He spent 4 of the 18 minutes on the question of evaluation standards, arguing that the OED's 16-inch plate at 2,000 meters was a specificity that served a narrow operational niche and shouldn't be treated as the universal benchmark for all precision qualification. It was a good argument. Tam looked up from her tablet when he made it. Voss looked at Cross. Response? He said. He's right that 16-inch at 2000 isn't universal, she said. It's the standard for the specific operational context the program is certifying for. If the question is whether Meridian's methodology produces shooters who meet a different standard, she paused. The answer is yes, it does. It produces shooters who meet the standard it was designed for. Which is, Tam asked, a controlled environment with consistent conditions and fixed distances. Cross looked at Tam directly. That's a real and useful capability. It's not the capability the program is trying to certify. Pressler leaned forward slightly. What's the cost of maintaining the OED standard at facilities that aren't currently meeting it? 3 to 6 months of adjusted training emphasis, Cross said. No new equipment, no new staff, a recalibration of how instructors evaluate, specifically what they're looking for versus what they're looking at. She paused. That distinction is the program. That's what changes the output. The room was quiet. Jacoby turned a page in his folder and didn't look up from it for a moment. When he did, his face had the quality of a man making a calculation. Cross, he said, you ran this evaluation at Fortuna Range last year. Yes. Their certification output dropped 19% in the quarter following the evaluation. It did. That's not a strong advertisement. The 19% were people who'd been certified under the previous standard who didn't meet the revised one, she said. Calling that a drop in output is one way to read it. She looked at him. Another way to read it is that those 19% shouldn't have been certified in the first place. Jacoby looked at her. The question, she said, is whether the certification means something. If it does, then producing accurate certifications matters more than producing high certification rates. She paused. If it doesn't, then either methodology is fine because the number is just a number. Tam put her tablet down. Pressler looked at Voss. Voss looked at the table for a moment, at the printed photograph of the whiteboard framework that Cross had placed in the center, and then looked up. We'll take a recess, he said. 30 minutes. He stood, and the room stood with him, and Cole watched Jacoby gather his folder with the specific movements of a man who'd said everything he'd come to say and was now waiting for an outcome he couldn't control. Across the table, Cross picked up her notebook. She didn't look at Cole, but she turned the notebook to a specific page and set it briefly where the edge of the table met the space between them. A single line of handwriting. His handwriting, transferred from whatever page she'd photographed or copied from his range log notations during the morning. I have been selecting for how people carry themselves, for confidence, for what I read as strength. I don't know when this became my standard instead of a byproduct of it. He looked at it for 2 seconds. She picked the notebook back up and stood. Cole sat alone in this conference room for the 30-minute recess with the printed whiteboard on the table and the desert morning outside the building's walls and the specific weight of a week that had not gone the way any week at Red Mesa had ever gone in 11 years, and tried to calculate what he'd lost and what he'd found, and whether the account, taken together, was something he could recognize as forward motion. He was still working on that when the door opened and Voss walked back in. Voss walked back in alone. That was the first thing Cole registered, that it was just Voss, without the oversight representatives, without Alcott, without Jacoby, just the Admiral, moving with the same unhurried deliberateness he'd carried onto the range 4 days ago, pulling out the chair at the head of the table and sitting down like a man who had somewhere to be, and had decided this was it. He looked at Cole. They're meeting with Cross separately, he said. Pressler and Tam. They asked for 15 minutes with her before the full group reconvenes. Cole absorbed this. It means they have questions the open room isn't the right place for. Voss folded his hands on the table. It's not a bad sign. It's not a guaranteed good one either. What's Jacoby doing? Jacoby is in Alcott's office. Voss paused, and something moved through his expression that was not quite satisfaction and not quite regret. They're having a conversation about what constitutes appropriate use of a facility's range assets and administrative resources for purposes that aren't formally scheduled through the evaluation office. Cole looked at him. The Range 2 visit. Alcott approved it, Voss said. She had the authority to approve it. The question is whether the way it was used, specifically as a parallel data collection effort designed to compete with an ongoing formal evaluation, crossed a line that the authority to approve range access doesn't cover. "'Tis pas short most chatronski," he paused. "I think it does." Alcott thinks she may have been insufficiently specific in vetting the purpose of the visit. Jacoby thinks he was operating within the parameters of his professional relationship with this facility. Three different reads on the same situation. Usually how it works. Voss looked at the printed whiteboard photo in the center of the table. "The data you helped her prepare this morning." Cole blinked. "She told you." "She told me you came in at 0610 and worked the presentation framework with her." He looked at Cole. "Why?" Cole thought about how to answer that. The simple version was that she'd needed it and he'd had the relevant skill. The more accurate version was longer and more complicated and involved a week of having things he'd held as permanent truths rearranged into different configurations. "Because she was right about what she'd found," Cole said, "and I knew how to help her show it, and the outcome mattered. For the program, and for my facility." He paused. "And because she spent 2 days fixing the way I evaluate shooters, which was broken in ways I hadn't recognized. That warranted something back." Voss looked at him for a long moment. Not assessing. He'd already done his assessing. Something more like confirmation of a calculation already run. "You know what she did before the OED program," Voss said. "It wasn't quite a question. Some of it," Cole said. "She told me about the qualification instructor work, the deployments, HALM." Voss nodded slowly. "She doesn't usually tell people about HALM." Cole didn't know what to do with that, so he didn't do anything with it. "The work she did before this program," Voss said, "the operational deployments under the Precision Specialties track. There are 6 engagements on her record that I'm aware of and probably 2 or 3 more that I'm not cleared to know about. 4 of those 6 were situations where the standard solution had failed or wasn't available, and someone made a call under conditions that most people in this business would have used as a reason to stand down." He paused. "She didn't stand down." The conference room was quiet. The desert outside was doing what it always did, pressing its heat against the building's walls, indifferent and patient. "She came here," Cole said, "and sat under my canopy." "She comes to facilities like this one and sits under canopies," Voss said. "That's the job now. Finding the people who could do what she did and building the training environment that gives them room to become what they're capable of." He looked at the table. "It's important work. Less visible than what came before it. She doesn't complain about that." "No," Cole said. "She wouldn't." The door opened. Pressler came in first, then Tam, then Cross, and Cole read the room in the 2 seconds before anyone spoke. Pressler had the look of a man who'd received an answer he'd been carrying a question toward for a while. Tam's tablet was closed, which meant she'd stopped taking notes, which meant the information-gathering phase was over. Cross had her notebook under her arm, and her face was the same as it always was. Present, level, not telling him anything he hadn't already known about her. Jacoby was not with them. Everyone sat. Pressler looked at Voss. "We've had a chance to review the evaluation findings in context of today's comparative presentation. We have a few questions for the record before we make our recommendation." "Go ahead," Voss said. Pressler looked at his tablet. "Chief Cross?" "The gap metric your evaluation uses. The differential between technical scores and environmental reading assessments. This has been applied at how many facilities now?" 7, she said. "Over 3 years." "And the pattern is consistent across all 7? "Consistent in the finding, variable in degree. Some facilities show a smaller gap. None show no gap." "The Meridian Group methodology," Tam said. "You characterized it as producing valid results for a specific context. Can that context and the OED's target context coexist within the same certification framework?" Cross paused. Cole watched her think about this. Actually think, not perform thinking. "In principle, yes," she said. "If the certification itself specifies which standard was applied and what operational context it's valid for, then both methodologies could produce useful outputs for different purposes." She paused. "The problem is that a certification without that specificity gets used as a general credential, which is what's currently happening. A shooter certified under Meridian standard gets deployed to a context that requires the OED standard, and the gap becomes a field problem instead of a training problem. Tam wrote something. Recommendation, Pressler said to no one in particular. Tam looked up. Maintain the OED framework as the primary certification standard for the specialty track. Require facilities to document which standard was applied to which certifications issued in the last 2 years and flag any that don't meet the OED benchmark for review. That's going to require reevaluation of some previously issued certifications, Voss said. Yes, Tam said. It will. The word Meridian was not spoken again in the conference room. It didn't need to be. Voss looked at Cross. Your evaluation report. When can you have the final version to the program director? End of day Friday, she said. As scheduled. The remedial instruction block. He looked at Cole. 3 days were prescribed. You've completed 2. Yes, sir. Master Sergeant Barrett. Voss's voice had a quality Cole hadn't heard from him before. Not warmer exactly, but less formal. The tone of a man addressing someone he'd made a preliminary judgment about and was now updating. Your testimony this morning about what occurred on the first day of this week and your characterization of your own gaps, that required something. I want to acknowledge it. Cole kept his face level. I said what was accurate, sir. You said what was accurate and uncomfortable, Voss said. Those aren't always the same thing, and it doesn't always happen in the same moment. He paused. The third remedial day. I'm going to recommend you use it to run tomorrow's Range 4 session as primary instructor, with Chief Cross in the observer position. Cole looked at him. You're not watching anymore, Voss said. You're running it. She'll be behind you. It was the inversion of the inversion. He'd spent 2 days learning to see from the outside. Now he was being put back on the inside with different eyes and someone watching to confirm they'd taken. Yes, sir, he said. What? The formal session ended at 10:40. Alcott emerged from her office at 11:05 with an expression that was tightly controlled in the way that expressions were when someone had just had a conversation they hadn't enjoyed and were deciding how to carry it forward. She found Cole in the hallway outside the administrative wing and stopped. Barrett? Ma'am. She looked at him for a moment. The hallway was empty. Dugan had taken the trainees to an early lunch break after the morning session delay, and the administrative staff were in their offices with the particular focused quality that meant they were all very aware of what had been happening and had decided that today was an excellent day to have a lot of work to do. The Range 2 authorization, Alcott said. I made a judgment call. Yes, ma'am. I should have flagged it with you. She paused. And with Voss. Ma'am. She looked at him with the expression of a woman who found something difficult to say and was going to say it anyway because the alternative was worse. I've worked with Jacoby for 7 years. When he came back and said he had a team that wanted to run a comparative baseline, I took it at face value. She stopped. I shouldn't have. He's good at making things sound reasonable, Cole said. Not as a defense of Jacoby, just as a fact. Yes. She paused. You testified this morning against your own professional interest. I testified accurately about what I observed, which was against your professional interest. Cole thought about arguing with this and recognized that it would be wasted effort. I don't know yet what it costs me, he said. Probably less than you think, she said. Voss he doesn't work that way. She paused again as though deciding something. Jacoby is being asked to take a leave extension. Formal administrative review of the Range 2 visit. It'll be 60 days minimum. Cole absorbed that. And after 60 days? That depends on the review. She looked at the hallway floor for a moment. His consultancy relationship with Meridian is going to be the central question. You can't have a senior range officer running concurrent commercial evaluations on a federal facility's ranges without disclosing the relationship. She looked back up. He didn't disclose it. The hallway was quiet. He thought it would work, Cole said. He thought he'd get the contract, Alcott said, and it would have looked like good initiative instead of a conflict of interest. The difference between those two things being the outcome. In practice, yes. She looked at him. That's not the way it's supposed to work. No, Cole said. It's not. She went back to her office. Cole stood in the hallway for a moment and then went to find something to eat. because it was past 1100, and he hadn't eaten since 0530, and the morning had taken most of what he'd had. He found Cross in this dining facility. This was becoming a pattern, which he'd have found irritating a week ago and found something else now. Comfortable wasn't quite the word, but it was in the same territory. She was at the same table she'd used the first day, with a coffee and something that might have been a sandwich eaten too fast to remember, her notebook open and her pen moving. He got food and sat across from her without asking. She didn't look up from the notebook. "How's Alcott?" "Functional." He opened a water bottle. "Jacoby's taking an extended leave, administrative review." "I heard." She wrote something. "You heard in the last 20 minutes?" Voss texted me. Cole looked at her. She still hadn't looked up. "The oversight reps," he said, "the separate 15 minutes before the group session. Pressler wanted specifics on the field applications," she said. "Cases where the gap metric, the difference between technical score and environmental reading, had a documented outcome in operational context." She paused. "I gave him 3 cases. Sanitized but specific. And he understood why 16 inches at 2,000 meters matters." She set the pen down and finally looked at him. "Sometimes you need a case that makes the abstraction concrete. Pressler's the kind of person who needs to touch the edge of a real thing before the framework makes sense to him." "What were the 3 cases?" She held his gaze for a moment. "The first one involved a shooter who'd been certified under a standard similar to Meridian's," she said, "deployed to a support role that was supposed to be low risk. The assessment of the situation changed, and the role didn't match what was needed, and it ended badly." She paused. "Not because the shooter wasn't trained, because the training they'd received had been measured against the wrong standard and nobody caught it before the deployment." The dining facility moved around them. Trays, voices, the industrial coffee maker. Cole felt the weight of what she'd said settle in. "How badly?" he said. She looked at him. "Badly enough that Pressler already knew the case number when I referenced it without naming it." That was the thing about important people. They sometimes carried the specific weight of failures they'd been adjacent to and couldn't discuss openly, but also couldn't put down. Pressler had walked into the review room with a question he already knew the shape of. Cross had given him the language to answer it. "The program," Cole said. "Is it going to hold?" "The recommendation was made," she said. "The program director has to ratify it. He usually follows oversight." She paused. "Usually. You're not certain." "I'm never certain about things I don't control." She picked up her coffee. "I'm certain about things I do control. The report will be accurate. The methodology will be documented. Whatever decision the program director makes, he'll be making it with the full picture in front of him. And if he decides Meridian's way is more cost-effective, then I'll write the next evaluation report accurately too." She set the coffee down. "And the one after that. And I'll keep going back to facilities and running the observation blocks and documenting what I find, because eventually the pattern makes an argument that nobody can sustain ignoring." She paused. "That's a longer timeline than I'd choose. But it's the job." Cole looked at her. There was something in the way she'd said, "It's the job," that had a different weight than it usually did when people said things like that. Heavier, but not resigned. The weight of a choice made and maintained across a long time. "You could be doing something else," he said. She looked at him. "Everyone could be doing something else." "You specifically, what you can do." She was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet that preceded something real. "I did something else," she said. "For a long time, I was good at it." She looked at the coffee cup. "And then Halm didn't come home, and I spent about 6 months being useless to everyone, including myself. And eventually I figured out that the thing that made it possible to keep going was finding a way to make what he taught me continue." She paused, not as a monument to him, just as the thing had value, and the value shouldn't stop because he stopped. She looked up. "So I built the program. It took 2 years. It's imperfect. The methodology has blind spots I haven't found yet." She paused. "But it keeps going." Cole sat with that for a moment. "Does it help?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "On good days." A pause. "On other days, it's just the work, and the work is enough." He nodded. He understood that. It was, he thought, one of the more honest things anyone had said to him in 11 years. The afternoon was Range 4, not a session, just Cole, running through what tomorrow's stage would look like, walking the range boundaries with his notebook, doing the thing he'd watched her do, writing down what he observed about conditions rather than what he assumed about them. The exercise felt different from inside than it had looked from outside. Slower, more uncomfortable. There were long stretches where he stood at a berm marker and looked at the air moving over the mid-range terrain and didn't know what he was looking at, just knew he was looking, and trusted that looking was the beginning of learning to see. He found the wash at 950 meters, walked down to it, a shallow depression in the desert floor, barely visible from the firing line, the kind of feature you'd never notice unless you were standing in it. It ran parallel to the range boundary for about 40 meters before curving away to the west. In the afternoon heat, standing in it, he could feel the different air, slightly cooler off the earth, producing a microconvection that bled horizontally at low elevation and then pulled upward as the heat built through the morning. He stood in the wash for a while and looked at the target line from the ground. Different from the firing line, different from the scoring station, different from any position he'd occupied on this range in 11 years. He wrote in the notebook, "The range looks completely different from inside the problem." He wasn't sure if that was a marksmanship observation or something else. He wrote it down anyway. At 16:30, he found Dugan near the armory. Dugan looked at him with the particular caution of someone who'd spent a week being adjacent to significant events and was not entirely sure which way the institutional weather was going to settle. "Rourke," Cole said. "She's on the Range 4 session tomorrow." "Yes, sir. She and Marsh, per Chief Cross's request. Add 2 more from the intake group, your choice." He paused. "Put Rourke on the primary bench first." Dugan's eyebrows moved. "Usually we go in file order. Tomorrow we go in order of who hasn't been given room yet." Cole looked at him. "Primary bench first. Your choice on the other 2. Same principle." Dugan absorbed this. "Yes, sir." And Dugan. "Sir." The gear monkey comment. First morning. Dugan's expression went carefully neutral in the way of a man who had opinions he was paid not to express. "I'm aware," Cole said, "that it spread through the intake group." "Sir, I didn't—" "I know you didn't. It spread because 43 people were there." Cole looked at him. "Tomorrow, after the Range 4 session, I'm going to address the full intake group. I want everyone present. Arrange it." Dugan blinked. "A briefing?" "Not a briefing." Cole thought about the word. "A correction." He walked back toward the administrative wing. Cross was leaving the facility at 17:15, which Cole knew because he happened to be at his vehicle when she came through the main exit door with her kit bag over one shoulder and her rifle case in her other hand. She moved through the parking area with the same quality she moved through everything, present, unhurried, the walk of someone who had enough left at the end of the day to still be paying attention. She saw him. They'd been navigating the space between formal and something else for 3 days and hadn't named it, which was fine. Some things didn't need names while they were still in progress. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she confirmed. "You're in the observer position." "Yes." "What are you going to be looking for?" She thought about it. Actually thought about it, not the performed pause. "Whether you've changed what you see or whether you've just changed what you look for." She shifted the rifle case. "They're different things." "How will you know which one?" "By what you miss," she said. "Everyone still misses things. What you miss tells you where your actual standard lives." He nodded. He'd known the answer before he asked the question mostly, but hearing it put it in a place he could hold on to. "Cross," he said. She waited. "I'm sorry." He held her gaze. "For the first morning. Not because it cost me. The review, the remedial sessions, for what it was, before all of that." He paused. "You were doing your job. I decided what you were before you opened your mouth, and I made you prove something in public that you shouldn't have had to prove." She looked at him for a moment. The quality of her attention was the same as it always was. Direct, complete, no part of her somewhere else. But something in it had shifted the fraction that indicated she was receiving this rather than evaluating it. "I know," she said. "That's not enough." "No," she said. "It's not. But it's what an honest person says, and I've worked with enough people who wouldn't say it to know the difference. She paused. I accept it. She started toward her vehicle. Cross. She stopped, turned slightly. Palm, Cole said. He would have liked watching you work. She looked at him across the distance of the parking lot, and the late desert light came in from the west and turned everything in its honest, unsparing way and showed whatever it showed. Yeah, she said quietly. I think he would have. She got in her vehicle and drove out through the facility gate, and the dust rose behind her and the wind took it apart before it reached the range. The Range 4 session the following morning ran from 700 to 12:30. Rourke went to the primary bench first, as Cole had arranged, and she went there without fanfare because she was the kind of person who treated opportunity the same way she treated everything else, quietly, without wasting it on acknowledgement. She ran the full OED distance sequence, 800 to 2,000 meters, 16-inch plate, variable conditions with no pre-briefed wind data, and she sat with the uncertainty the way Cross had described, got quiet, read the problem, and didn't reach for the procedure when the procedure didn't fit. Her hit rate at 2,000 meters was 62% on the first string. Not spectacular, but the misses were specific. They fell in a consistent pattern that told a clear story about which part of the environmental read she hadn't yet built, and a consistent pattern was teachable in a way that random misses weren't. Cole narrated. Behind him, Cross wrote, He caught things he wouldn't have caught 4 days ago. The way Rourke's support hand adjusted its pressure between the first and third shots of each string, not much, barely perceptible, but enough to shift her point of contact and introduce a variance that was invisible in the pre-shot setup and visible in the impact pattern. He caught the moment she made a wind call she trusted and the moment she made one she didn't, because the difference was in her pace. Confident reads produced a faster break. Uncertain reads produced a slight hesitation that wasn't long enough to call a hitch, but was long enough to matter. After the second string, he called a ceasefire and came to the bench. Your left hand, he said. Rourke looked at him. Third round in every string. Your support hand pressure is shifting. It's subtle, but it's consistent. He crouched beside the bench. Show me your grip before you load the next round. She showed him. He made a small adjustment. 2 fingers, the position of the heel of her palm against the chassis. A fraction of an inch. Try that, he said. She tried it, shot the third string. Her pattern at 1,500 meters tightened by a measurement that showed up clearly on the scoring sheet. It wasn't a transformation. She still had work to do, months of it, before the environmental read was something she could trust under the kind of conditions that actually tested it. But the tightening was real, and it was built on something specific and correctable, and that was the difference between a training session and a diagnosis. Marsh shot second. His results were what they were. Technically clean, environmentally limited. The same gap Cross had identified in the observation stage now visible in Cole's narration in a way that it hadn't been before. Cole caught it and named it specifically, which was more than he'd done in the week before this one. The other 2 trainees shot in the afternoon block. Cole ran all 4 sessions from the instructor position, Cross behind him, neither of them talking much during the strings. She wrote things down and he knew she was watching him, and he let himself be watched without performing for the watching, which was harder than it sounded and took until the 3rd session to actually achieve. At the end of the last string, she closed her notebook. He turned around. Well, he said. She thought about it. He'd learned that the thinking time was real and not a performance, and he waited it out. You're still missing the micro-expressions, she said. The tells that happen in the 2 seconds before the pre-shot routine begins. You're catching the routine itself now, and you're catching what the routine produces, but you're not yet reading the shooter before they start. She paused. That's a 6-month problem, not a 3-day one. What am I doing right? You asked what Rourke needed from you instead of what she was doing wrong, she said. That's the right question. Most instructors never ask it. He held that. The hand adjustment, he said. That was good, she said, not generously, accurately, the way she said everything. You saw something specific and named it specifically and gave a correction that addressed the source instead of the symptom. She paused. That's what the program is trying to produce. Cole looked at range 4. The target line, the steel at distance. The wash he now knew was at 950 meters because he'd stood in it. The range looked the same as it always had from the firing line and different in every way that mattered. The full intake group, he said, this afternoon. I'll be there. Derkan. He had them assembled at 1500 on the main range, all 43, plus Dugan, plus 3 of the facility's permanent staff who'd heard about it through channels Cole hadn't bothered to close. Cross stood at the back of the group. Cole stood at the front. He didn't use notes. He'd thought about notes and decided that reading from paper was the wrong posture for what this was. Monday morning, he said. Most of you were there. Some of you heard about it after. He looked at the group. Nobody's face was blank. They all knew exactly what he was referencing. I saw someone I'd decided about before she'd done anything, and I used a public stage to make that decision official. And I was wrong. He paused. Not wrong in the way that's easy to live with. Wrong in the specific way that comes from deciding you already know something when you don't. He looked at them. I've been running intake groups here for 11 years. 11 years of deciding who's worth watching based on criteria I thought were solid. He paused. Some of them were. Some of them were just about what I was comfortable recognizing as strength. He let that sit for a moment. Those aren't the same thing, and I didn't know it was 2 different things until this week. Marsh was in the front row. He was watching Cole with the direct attention of someone who'd heard something like this before, but not from an instructor, not from this position. Rourke was 3 rows back. Her face was neutral, not closed, just waiting. The woman you saw on Monday, Cole said. Her name is Chief Warrant Officer Evelyn Cross. She designed the evaluation program this facility runs. She spent 14 years in operational precision roles before she built the methodology your certification is based on. And she came here, sat under that canopy, and I called her a gear mechanic in front of you. He paused. I want you to remember that. Not as a story about her, Shaz. She doesn't need the story, but as a marker for yourselves. For the moment when you look at someone and decide you already know what they are, that moment is almost always where the mistake begins. He looked at the back of the group where Cross was standing. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the range. Somewhere between the firing line and the far target stakes, at the middle distance, at whatever the air over the 950-meter wash was telling her in that specific moment. She wasn't watching his correction as a monument to what she'd done. She was watching the range. He turned back to the group. That's all, he said. Cross submitted her final evaluation report at 16:52 on Friday afternoon. Cole knew because he was in the administrative wing finishing his own range log entries when she came out of the planning room and handed the report package to the admin specialist on duty. She did it the same way she did everything, without ceremony, without pausing to make the moment significant, just the clean action of someone completing a task that was finished. He caught her in the hallway outside. Done? He said. Done, she confirmed. When do you leave? Tomorrow morning. She looked at the hallway. I have 2 other facilities scheduled this month. Fortuna Range is doing a follow-up on last year's evaluation, then a new site in the Eastern Territory that hasn't run the OED block before. Starting from scratch. Starting from scratch, she said, which is fine. It's where you learn the most. He thought about that. About the particular patience required to go to a new facility every time and find the canopy and sit under it and wait for whatever version of the first morning would happen and then do the work of showing a different way of looking to people who mostly didn't yet know their way of looking had a problem. The program director, he said. The ratification. He signed it yesterday, she said. OED framework stays as the primary certification standard. Facilities with certifications issued under non-compliant methodologies are being reviewed. She paused. Meridian lost the contract bid. Cole absorbed that. Jacoby, he said. The administrative review is its own process, she said. I don't have visibility into it, and I'm not going to speculate about the outcome. She looked at him. What happens to Jacoby is a consequence of what Jacoby did. It's not something I need to track. It was a clean place to put it. Cole wasn't sure he'd have put it there if their positions were reversed. He said so. I've learned to be careful about how much energy I give to what happens to people who try to undermine the work, she said. It's a long fight. You can't afford to spend it on the wrong things. She paused. The work is the right thing. He nodded. She shifted her kit bag. Tomorrow's session, Rourke, she'll be on range 4 again. Good. She paused. She has something. Give her the hard problem sets, not the standard sequence, the variable ones, the scenarios where the conditions change mid-string and she has to recalibrate in real time. She looked at him. She'll resist it. She won't say she's resisting it, but you'll see it. Don't let her organize away from the difficulty. Cole thought about his own instruction log, about the things Cross had seen in his narration that he hadn't known were visible, about what it meant to have spent 11 years in a place and still be finding the wash at 950 meters. I'll figure it out, he said. I know, she said, not reassuringly, just accurately. She started toward the exit. Cross, he said. She stopped. This was a habit between them now, her stopping one last time. He thought she probably tolerated it more than she'd admit. You'll come back, he said, for the follow-up evaluation. It wasn't quite a question. The program schedules follow-ups at 12 months, she said. So yes. She looked at him for a moment. So yes. She walked out. Through the administrative wing's small window, he watched her go across the parking lot to her vehicle. The same unhurried walk, the same quality of attention directed at whatever was in front of her, the rifle case over one arm and the kit bag over the other. She reached the vehicle and opened the rear, stowed the equipment with the same economy she brought to everything, and got in without looking back at the building. The engine started. The vehicle pulled out. The dust rose and the wind took it apart. Cole stood in the hallway for a while. Then he went back to his range log, opened it to the current page, and sat down to write. 12 months later, when Cross returned to Red Mesa for the follow-up evaluation, she found something she hadn't expected. She'd expected incremental improvement, better environmental reading scores, a tighter gap between technical execution and contextual application, the normal yield of a facility that had understood the message and was trying to implement it. She'd seen this at Fortuna Range and at 3 other sites in the intervening year. What she found at Red Mesa was Rourke. Dana Rourke had spent 12 months on Range 4 under Cole's instruction, running variable problem sets, sitting with conditions she couldn't preload a solution for, building the specific and uncomfortable skill of reading what was in front of her, rather than what she'd expected to find. Her hit rate at 2,000 meters in the follow-up evaluation's first string was 84%. In conditions that Cross had deliberately waited until mid-afternoon to run, the variable wind, the thermal shift off the wash, the heading changes that made the Meridian-style shooter go 3 for 5. 84%. Cross sat in the observer position and watched Cole instruct, and she wrote in her notebook, and she was aware, in the particular way she'd learned to be aware of things, that what she was watching was something that had been made possible by the specific sequence of events that had started with a woman sitting alone under a canopy with a torque wrench, not by the shot at 2,000 meters, not by the 5 for 5 demonstration on Range 2, by the gap framework on a whiteboard at 0630 in the morning, built by 2 people who'd arrived early because they both thought early was the right time to show up. After the final string, she sat in the same dining facility chair and ate the same thing she always ate, and Cole sat across from her, and they reviewed the session data with the particular comfort of people who'd developed a working language between them and knew how to use it. Rourke, he said. Yes. He looked at her. He'd gotten better at the things she'd told him to work on. The pre-routine tells, the micro-reads, the question of what a shooter needed rather than what they were doing wrong. He'd gotten better at all of it, and he was still imperfect in specific and nameable ways that she could have listed but didn't, because the improvement was real and the remaining gaps were the kind that required time and not instruction. What do I do with her next? He said. Cross looked at her notebook, looked at the dining facility around them, looked out the window at the range, where the steel was still warm from the afternoon's use, and the last light was settling over the target line in the particular way it settled at Red Mesa. Hard and honest, softening nothing, showing everything clearly. Send her to the OED program, she said. I'll put her name on the list. Cole was quiet for a moment, understanding what that meant, what it meant for Rourke, and what it meant about the distance they'd covered. She'll go, he said. I know she will. Cross closed her notebook. She's the kind of person who goes. Quote. Cole Barrett ran intake groups at Red Mesa for 6 more years. He never again decided what someone was before they'd shown him. Not perfectly. He still made assumptions, still carried the residue of 11 years of looking a particular way, still occasionally caught himself reading presentation instead of ability. But he caught himself catching it, which was the difference. And every time he caught it, he heard something in the back of his mind that sounded like, pay attention to the quiet one. He eventually created a supplemental module for the orientation intake, 2 hours, added to the first day's schedule before the live fire block. He called it the environmental reading session. No rifles, no targets, just the range and the conditions and the specific uncomfortable work of sitting with uncertainty until it became information. Every new group hated it at first. Every group came to understand why it was there. Dana Rourke spent 3 years in the OED program before joining its instruction team. She was good at it in the specific way that Halm had been good at it, the way that Cross had tried to build into the methodology. Not from theory, but from the accumulated knowledge of someone who'd been given room to become what they were capable of and had done the slow, unglamorous work of becoming it. Cross visited Red Mesa twice more in the years after the first follow-up, each time for program evaluations, each time finding something different and something the same. The same range, the same desert heat, the same hard morning light that softened nothing and showed everything clearly, the same canopy on the western edge, corrugated metal overhang, worn equipment table, the smell of gun oil and hot steel. She'd sit under it sometimes, between sessions, and work on whatever needed working on, and the range would move around her, and she'd let it move. Nobody ever called her a gear mechanic again, not because they'd been warned off it, because the facility had learned, slowly, imperfectly, the way real learning happened, to look past what they expected to see, and that was what she'd come for. The most dangerous thing you can do, in any field, in any room, is decide what someone is before they've shown you. What you miss in that moment is usually the thing that mattered most.